Hello. Welcome to the channel if you're new, and welcome back if you're a regular. Tell me where you're from and what time you're listening. Now get comfy and let's begin. I was 17 at the time, and my boyfriend, Bob, and I were on a secluded farm access road with only one way in and out. It was November, not particularly cold, but the sky was overcast. I had the window rolled down a little as Bob smoked a cigarette and fiddled with the radio, trying to find something decent. I was sitting cross-legged, leaning against the passenger side door. The fields on both sides of the car were empty, as it was after harvest. As I casually glanced out the back window, I saw the shadowy figures of two men standing there, holding what looked like rifles. The moment they noticed I was looking at them, they quickly ducked behind the car. I should have heard their footsteps on the gravel with my window down, but it was completely silent. Panic surged through me, and I started locking the doors, screaming at Bob to start the engine. I never took my eyes off the rear of the car. At first, Bob thought I was messing around and laughed, but the fear in my voice finally got through to him. I yelled, "There are two guys out there, and I think they have guns." Bob quickly turned on the headlights and sped off. I expected to see them chasing us, cursing as they ran, but when I looked back, there was no one in sight. At the end of the road, Bob stopped and asked what had just happened. I was barely able to speak, but managed to tell him what I saw. Bob had been coming to that place for years with other girls, and nothing unusual had ever happened. I suggested maybe it was the farmer and another man, and they were just trying to scare us. But Bob said that wasn't possible. He knew the farmer, and if it had been him, he would have driven down the same road we were on. The farmer's place was too far away for him to be walking across fields at night with no flashlights. I asked if they could have been illegal hunters, but Bob pointed out that all the land was posted with no hunting signs because there were houses nearby, along the main road that led to the access road. If anyone had fired a weapon, someone would have heard and called the police. It made no sense for them to run or hide from us. We were just two teenagers in a car, and those were grown men with weapons. I was incredibly shaken, and Bob took me home. As I mulled it over in my mind, I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Bob never saw anything, so of course he doubted my story. We ended up breaking up after that night, and I think I scared him off. So what did I see? I have no idea, but I know what I saw. I'm now 62 years old, and I don't think I've ever been that terrified since. There was something deeply wrong about those figures. They were darker than the night itself and solid in form, but I couldn't make out any facial features. Their movements were stiff and awkward, yet they were completely silent. I wouldn't be sharing this story if I hadn't come across others online, 45 years later, who had similar experiences. Just to be clear, we weren't drinking, smoking, or on any kind of drugs. Could I have imagined the whole thing? I suppose I could have, but living here, kids like me often spent time in the farmlands or mountains, and I'd never encountered anything like that before. When I was 12, I was more mature than most kids my age, so my friends were usually a couple of years older. One night, a few of them invited me to a party at a place we called the Train Trestle. The plan was to meet up around midnight, just hang out, and maybe have a drink or two, like some wine coolers. I thought, sounds awesome. I'll definitely be there. It was a Friday night, and just to give you some context, the Train Trestle was about 3 or 4 miles from my house. 2 of those miles were through the woods, with a train track on one side and trees on the other. There was a narrow trail, maybe 6 feet wide, and about 50 yards down the trail, it took a turn into the woods. There were trees and brush between the trail and the tracks, thick enough that you could only catch glimpses of the train tracks. I'd been to the Train Trestle a bunch of times before, always during the day and with friends, but tonight I'd be going alone. I waited for my parents to go to bed and sneaked out through my window, heading toward the tracks. The moon was about 3/4 full, so it wasn't too dark, and I felt so grown up and free. I made my way to the trail and started walking. It was a crisp November night, and I liked the cold, so I enjoyed the walk. About halfway down the trail, I thought I heard something that sounded like a rock falling from the tracks. I stopped and tried to look through the trees at the tracks, but it was too obscured by the brush, so I continued on. A minute later, I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching on the gravel on the tracks. I stopped again, a little more concerned. My first thought was that it was a raccoon or maybe a cat walking on the tracks. I took another step and then heard what sounded like a whistle. I turned around, trying to see if I could spot anything on the tracks. Of course, this is when the moon went behind a cloud, and I heard another whistle, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the tracks. Being a dumb 12-year-old and thinking it might be one of my friends also heading to the party, I called out, "Hello!" There was complete silence. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and continued walking, though now I was feeling more uneasy. I picked up my pace. I was about half a mile from the trestle when I suddenly heard the whistling again. I couldn't make out the tune, but it sounded off, demented. I called out again, "Stacy, is that you?" The whistling stopped, and what I heard next froze my blood. It was low, but unmistakable. A deep, gruff laugh. I started running, realizing that someone was now running after me. I could hear rocks and gravel falling from the tracks, just a few yards to my right. Tears started streaming down my face as I remembered a small trail that would lead from the path I was on through the trees and brush, up to the tracks. I nearly screamed when I heard another low, deranged laugh, and it seemed like they knew exactly what I was thinking. I saw the connecting trail ahead and pushed myself to run faster. Just as I passed the trail, I heard the sound of someone leaping off the tracks, their feet hitting the ground, running after me. That's when I screamed. Whoever or whatever was chasing me was now right behind me. I could almost feel their hands swiping at my back, trying to grab me. I screamed again, full of terror, when, from in front of me, I heard, "Cat! Is that you, Cat?" "Stacy!" I screamed. Then I realized I could see a bit of the clearing ahead and a small campfire, but best of all, people I knew. I covered the few yards and practically leaped at my friend. She thought I just got spooked from the long, dark walk in the woods. When I was able to calm down, I explained to them what happened, hoping maybe one of them was pranking me, and Stacy said that she hadn't seen anyone on the trail but me. Her boyfriend and one of his friends grabbed a flashlight and went out to check it out. Meantime, my friends tried to calm me down. A few minutes later, the guys come back. They were quiet and a bit pale. "Well?" I asked. They looked at each other, then at us, and my friend's boyfriend said, "We didn't see anyone, but we found this in the center of the trail." From his pocket, he pulled out a gardening claw. My mind reeled when I realized that this is what I probably felt was swiping at my back. And he continued, "We could have sworn someone was whistling from back in the woods. Sometimes I wonder what would the outcome have been if I had taken the train tracks instead of the trail." It was January, and I was staying at a small winter cabin by an ice fishing lake. The cabin was basic, just the essentials, meant for people like me who enjoyed fishing or ice fishing. I usually brought a friend along, but sometimes I went alone, and I'd never had any problems before. I had planned for a 3-day stay with no real agenda other than fishing by the lake. On the first day, I arrived, unpacked, made myself at home, brewed some hot coffee, and spent most of the afternoon relaxing by the fireplace. The cabin was just a single room, so everything, bed, fireplace, etc., was in one space. I went to bed early and woke up at 7 a.m. to head out to the lake. It was about a 10-minute walk down a snowy forest path. When I arrived at the lake, I found a good spot, set up my gear, drilled into the ice, and began fishing. I find it relaxing, though I know many people find it boring. I stayed out there for several hours, probably 3 or 4, before packing up as the snow started picking up and the wind got stronger. I walked back down the path, but something caught my eye. I noticed a set of footprints in the snow, following my tracks from earlier. The footprints led right up to the spot where I had been fishing, then turned around and followed my path back to the cabin. I felt a bit uneasy, like someone had been out there, maybe even watching me. So I decided to follow the tracks to see where they led. They went back toward the cabin, but instead of heading up to it, they veered off into the woods. I couldn't see where they went from there, but the trail continued straight into the trees. Confused and a bit nervous, I went back inside the cabin to warm up by the fire. There was nothing else around for miles, so having someone out there was odd, especially in the winter. I made some food and stayed inside for the rest of the night, reading and keeping the fire going. About an hour after sunset, I heard something outside. A light crunching in the snow, the unmistakable sound of someone walking. I moved to the window and looked out, spotting a figure in the distance, walking toward the path. They were bundled up in thick clothing, making it hard to make out any details. When they reached the path, they turned and started heading straight for the cabin. I ducked down, holding my breath as the footsteps drew closer. They stopped right next to the wall, then moved closer to the window I was hiding under. I saw their shadow move around like they were peering inside, and then, suddenly, I saw their eyes staring right back at me. I jumped back, heart racing, as the person tried to open the window. I ran to grab a knife, but after a few more attempts to open the window, the person quickly ran off into the snowy woods, heading in the same direction they had come from. I packed up and rushed to my car, leaving the area as quickly as possible. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but they clearly knew I was staying there, having seen me earlier at the lake. Coming back in the middle of the night and trying to break in through the window was definitely not a good sign. I'm just glad I got out unharmed, but I can't shake the feeling that night could have been my last. A few years ago, I was part of a true scary stories server on Discord, a place where people shared their personal experiences with terrifying or spooky events that had happened to them. For a while, it was pretty entertaining. Sure, a lot of the stories sounded exaggerated, with common themes like, I saw a shadowy figure at the end of my bed, and other tales that seemed like they were straight out of a bad horror movie. But now and then, someone would post a story that didn't involve the supernatural at all, something truly believable. Occasionally, these stories were genuinely unsettling. I read a lot of spine-chilling things on that server, but most of them have faded from memory over time. They were creepy, sure, but not disturbing enough to leave a lasting impression. However, there was one story I'll never forget because it gave me chills when I read it. The poster started by assuring us that their story wasn't just a fabrication. Even though they were pretty young when it happened, just thinking or writing about it as an adult still caused them a lot of stress. They explained that their early years were marked by tragedy. Their dad had died from a drug overdose when they were very young, leaving them to be raised by their single mom in a small apartment just down the street from their grandma's house. Their mom had dated a little, obviously trying to find a stepdad to provide them with some sort of father figure. The incident happened while their mom was out on a date. Usually, their grandma would babysit them whenever their mom needed to go out, but that night, the grandma was working. So, though it wasn't ideal, the 9 or 10-year-old storyteller was left alone in their mom's ground floor apartment. At first, it seemed a bit irresponsible, but the storyteller was quick to reassure everyone that it wasn't a big deal. It was back when Yu-Gi-Oh was really popular, and as long as they had their cards and a box set of the show to keep them entertained, being left alone for an hour or two wasn't a problem. They weren't going to wander out of the apartment or get into trouble while they were busy with their precious Yu-Gi-Oh cards. But then, at some point that evening, while they were playing with their cards and watching TV, they heard a tapping on the window. Remember, they lived in a ground floor apartment, so anyone could have walked up and started tapping on the glass. There wasn't anything immediately scary or weird about someone knocking on the window. But when the storyteller got up and walked toward the window, they drew back the curtains, only to find the face of a complete stranger staring back at them. Not their grandfather, not an uncle, but a stranger. Shocked and confused, they backed away from the window, letting the curtains fall back into place. But then a loud crash echoed through the room. Broken glass rained down onto the carpet at the foot of the curtains, and just as they processed what had happened, another smash sent more shards scattering across the floor in front of them. At that point, they said they just tossed their Yu-Gi-Oh cards onto the floor and bailed, rushing out of the back door of the apartment and over to a neighbor's house. pounding on the door in a state of abject terror as they looked over their shoulder every so often to ensure the mysterious predator wasn't hot in pursuit. But thankfully, the neighbor answers the door, lets our storyteller in before taking the time to calm them down to get the full story out of them. Naturally, they called the cops immediately, who rushed over since they were given the description of a home invasion in progress. The neighbor then gets in touch with storyteller's mom to let her know the awful news, who immediately rushes home to comfort their terrified son. Then after that, both the neighbor and the storyteller's mom accompany them back to the apartment where the cops are still searching the property and surrounding area for any sign of the attempted intruder. Apparently, one of the cops approaches the mom at this point and shows her something in a clear plastic evidence bag. The mom stares at it, turns pale, then kneels down and hugs our storyteller tight, fighting to hold back tears as the neighbor says, "Oh my gosh." They both ended up staying at the grandma's place for like a week after while the window was repaired. And if that seems like a bizarre amount of time to fix a window and that something else might be behind them staying away from the apartment for a while, you would be right in thinking that. Our storyteller had their suspicions for a little while, but they were too young to really understand the implications of what had happened. The kind of danger they had been in wasn't clear until many years later when their mom explained to them just what had happened that evening. You see, it wasn't just the window that was being replaced. The entire apartment was being fitted with new, incredibly sturdy locks, CCTV cameras, just about everything short of a panic room, all being paid for by Grandma and Grandpa. The whole family was absolutely terrified, and it was all down to the piece of evidence that the cop showed the mom that night. The little thing in the clear plastic evidence bag that made her turn ashen and squeeze our storyteller in a big trembling bear hug. What was in that plastic bag was a photograph. A photograph of a young boy, curled up in bed, sleeping soundly. And that boy was our storyteller. The mom told a much older storyteller that the photo couldn't have been taken long before the attempted break-in. Something about the sheets on the bed being fairly new or something, I can't quite remember. Or maybe it was a new haircut that the storyteller had gotten. But either way, it was some detail in there that made it clear that the attempted intruder had broken into the apartment somehow, maybe only a week prior, and had taken a photograph of our storyteller while they were sleeping. I can only imagine they had done so to several other children too, making a little catalog of potential victims, pursuing them for hours on end before finally deciding the one they liked the most. I think that's what makes my blood run cold back when I read their story. The idea that the intruder had taken this perverse liking to them, one that was strong enough for them to be unable to resist their urges, or whatever kind of sick, twisted desires had them smashing that window that evening. The family only felt safe again when they heard news that a creeper whose MO was eerily similar to their own experiences was caught by police and jailed after being extradited to another state. But they kept the whole thing a secret from our storyteller until he was in his late teenage years. There was no more details after that. There wasn't any grand conclusion, just that it was something that had haunted him for years. I never read anything as horrifying as that on that Discord server. It made everything else seem tame in comparison, and I stopped reading shortly afterward. It's weird how we seek out scary stories, sometimes just to give ourselves a little thrill, but end up being genuinely traumatized. Not by the spooky skeleton stories, but by things that we know could have easily happened for real. My dad's side of the family is definitely strange. My grandmother had 8 kids with my grandfather in a span of 10 years, and then my grandfather went off and had 4 more children with different women. My grandfather was an abusive alcoholic, and nearly all of his children struggled with some kind of mental health issue growing up, which only got worse as they got older, my dad included. When my grandmother passed away, I was about 18. One of my aunts, who was very successful, rented a huge mansion in Florida for the whole family to stay in. This meant that all 8 of my grandmother's children, their spouses, kids, and one of the stepchildren came too, so there were about 25 to 30 people staying in the mansion. I was lucky enough to get a room all to myself. The floor plan on our floor was set up so that there were 5 rooms in a row, and if you walked out the sliding glass door in your room, you'd step out onto a balcony that connected all of the rooms. I had the room at the very end. Next to me were my 2 single uncles, and then my aunt and her kids, and another aunt and her kids, and so on. I love my family, But my uncles are really strange. One of them has schizophrenia, and the other is completely narcissistic. He literally believes he's Charlie Sheen. Dresses like him, acts like him, even got facial surgery to look more like him. It's bizarre, but I never thought anything of them being in the room next to mine. The first day at the mansion was great. We had a pool in the backyard and a beach right there. I was exhausted by around 11 p.m., so I left the blinds open on the sliding glass door to enjoy the view of the ocean as I fell asleep. But then I was woken up by a flash of light. I opened my eyes slowly and sat up, seeing a figure dash across the balcony. I was so freaked out I couldn't move. I didn't want to tell anyone, so I just lay there, unable to fall back asleep. The next day, my family went on as usual, but I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I saw on the balcony. I hoped it wasn't someone trying to break into the mansion. That night, while we were all sitting around for dinner, I noticed my narcissistic uncle was on his phone the whole time. He kept waving his phone around in front of my face, trying to get a signal. I was talking with my aunt about our dogs, showing her pictures on our phones, when my uncle handed his phone to her. She looked at it, then looked up at me, confused. "That's Emily," she said. My uncle got really uncomfortable and snatched the phone out of her hand, then left the room. Later that night, my aunt told me that there were pictures on his phone of me sleeping. Everything clicked, the flash and the figure on the balcony. I was terrified for the rest of the trip and kept my doors locked with the curtains closed at all times. The open road has always been synonymous with freedom for me, but I never anticipated it could feel like a cage. What began as a cross-country adventure turned into a frantic escape for my life. Each passing mile seemed to draw me closer to an ominous force that refused to let go. A road trip across the country had always been my dream. The thought of driving from one coast to the other, witnessing the transformation of landscapes from busy cities to vast plains to towering mountains, had always thrilled me since childhood. So, when I finally had enough time and money to make it happen, I didn't think twice. I loaded up my trusty Honda Civic, threw together a rough itinerary, and left my home in Boston to head west. The first few days were perfect. I cruised through charming New England villages, stopped at diners to indulge in homemade pie, and reveled in the changing views. As I entered the Midwest, the open land stretched out before me, giving me a sense of freedom I had never known. It was in a quiet Nebraska town, about a week into my journey, that everything shifted. I pulled into a dilapidated gas station on the edge of town. While filling up my tank, I noticed a group of men lounging around a battered pickup truck, their eyes fixed on me. Their intense stares sent a chill down my spine, but I dismissed it as the curiosity of small-town folk towards a visitor from out of state. I went inside to pay and grab a few snacks for the road. When I returned, the men had vanished. However, I could have sworn I saw their truck pulling away from the station as I made my way back to my car. I brushed off the feeling of unease and set off once more, turning up the radio and singing to calm my nerves. It wasn't until an hour later that I saw the truck again. It was far behind me, but the distinct rust on its hood was unmistakable. My pulse quickened, but I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. After all, there was only one major highway in this part of the state. But the truck didn't leave my mind. As I drove on, it stayed in my rearview mirror, never too close but always there. Sometimes it'd vanish for a while, only to reappear further down the road. Kept its distance, yet never fully disappeared. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, my anxiety had reached its peak. I considered pulling over in the next town, maybe finding a police station. But a nagging voice in my head warned me that stopping could be dangerous. What if these men were locals? What if they had connections in the area? In my panicked state, every small town seemed like a potential trap. So I kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, constantly checking my mirrors. The vast open landscape that had seemed so liberating just hours ago now felt oppressive. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to lose my pursuers. As night fell, I made a decision. At the next junction, instead of continuing west as planned, I turned south. It was a snap decision, one I hoped would throw off whoever was following me. For a blissful half hour, I saw no sign of the truck. I began to relax, thinking perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. Then at the crest of a hill, I saw headlights in the distance behind me. My blood ran cold. Somehow they had found me again. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my little Civic harder than I ever had before. The speedometer crept past 80, then 90, but the headlights kept gaining. My car wasn't built for this kind of speed, and every bump in the road felt like it might send me flying off into the darkness. Suddenly, a new set of headlights appeared ahead of me. Another truck, similar to the one behind me, was barreling towards me head-on. I realized with horror that they were trying to box me in. With seconds to react, I did the only thing I could think of. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, sending my car off the road and onto a dirt track I had barely glimpsed in the darkness. The car bounced violently, and I feared for a moment that I would lose control. But somehow, I managed to keep it together, plunging deeper into the unknown terrain. I killed my headlights, relying only on the faint moonlight to guide me. Behind me, I could hear the roar of engines as my pursuers tried to follow. But their larger vehicles weren't as nimble on the rough ground. And slowly, the sound began to fade. I drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Every bump and jolt sent a spike of fear through me, certain that this would be the moment I hit a ditch or a rock and it would all be over. But somehow, miraculously, I kept going. Finally, when I could no longer hear any sign of pursuit, I allowed myself to slow down. I was completely lost, surrounded by what looked like farmland, with no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel, and my heart was pounding so loud I was sure it could be heard for miles. I pulled to a stop in the shadow of what looked like an old barn, killed the engine, and sat in the darkness, straining my ears for any sound of approaching vehicles. But there was nothing, just the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of my situation sank in. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, being hunted by unknown assailants for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. My mind raced with questions. Who were these people? What did they want? How had they managed to follow me for so long without me noticing? I checked my phone, hoping against hope for a signal. But there was nothing. I was truly on my own. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here, and I couldn't go back the way I had come. My only option was to push forward and try to find help. I started the car, wincing at how loud the engine seemed in the pre-dawn quiet-away air, and began to drive. I chose my direction almost at random, hoping it would lead me to a main road or a town. After about an hour of careful driving, avoiding main roads and sticking to backcountry lanes, I finally saw signs of civilization. A small town appeared on the horizon, and I felt a glimmer of hope. But as I approached, that hope turned to dread. There, parked in front of the town's only gas station, was the rust-covered truck that had started this nightmare. I didn't slow down, didn't even consider stopping. I sped through the town as fast as I dared, praying that no one would spot me. In my rearview mirror, I saw a figure emerge from the gas station, pointing in my direction. Moments later, the truck's engine roared to life, and so the chase began again. I pushed my car to its limits, taking turns at dangerous speeds, constantly looking for any opportunity to lose my pursuers. But they seemed to know the area better than I did, anticipating my moves, always managing to stay on my tail. It wasn't until I crossed the state line into Colorado that I finally managed to shake them. The mountains provided cover, and the winding roads allowed me to use my car's smaller size to my advantage. By the time I reached Denver, I was exhausted, terrified, and completely paranoid. I went straight to the police station, but my story sounded insane even to my own ears. A mysterious group of men chasing me across multiple states for no apparent reason. The officers were skeptical, to say the least. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. I couldn't blame anyone for doubting me. If someone had shared this story with me a week ago, I'd have dismissed it just the same. In the end, I had to give up on my road trip. I sold my car, booked a flight, and flew back home, unable to stop glancing over my shoulder in the airport, half expecting those men to appear out of nowhere. Once back in Boston, I tried to return to my usual routine, but something inside me had shifted. The feeling of being watched never left me, as though I was being pursued. I became excessively alert, constantly scanning my surroundings for any signs of danger, always ready to flee. Time passed, and eventually the fear started to fade, but the experience lingered in my mind, leaving a permanent scar. I never learned who those men were or why they'd followed me. Maybe it was a case of mistaken identity, or perhaps I had unknowingly seen something I wasn't meant to at that gas station. I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that the open road, once a symbol of limitless freedom and adventure, now evokes a deep sense of vulnerability and fear. The wide stretches of America, which once called to me with the promise of exploration, now feel like a treacherous and unpredictable place where anyone could become a target. I still travel, but never by car and never alone. The cross-country trip I dreamed of has turned into a nightmare that haunts me. And whenever I spot a rusty pickup truck in my rearview mirror, my heart races. For a moment, I'm transported back to that dark highway, fleeing for my life from an invisible threat I'll never fully understand. The road may stretch endlessly ahead, but for me, that journey is finished. Some adventures, I've learned, are better left as mere fantasies. The first rule of urban exploration is to never go alone. The second is to always trust your instincts. I broke both rules that night, and what I found in that abandoned building will haunt me for the rest of my life. I've always been drawn to forgotten places. There's something eerily beautiful about a building left to decay, nature slowly reclaiming what was once a bustling hub of human activity. I'd been photographing abandoned structures for years. Each trip was a mix of art and adrenaline, a chance to capture the beauty in decay. The old Hartley factory had been on my radar for months. A massive complex on the outskirts of town, abandoned for decades, its towering silhouette a stark reminder of the city's industrial past. Getting inside had always been a challenge. The place was surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire, and local security was known to patrol the area frequently. But on that fateful night, I finally saw my chance. A storm had knocked down part of the fence, leaving a gap just wide enough for a person to slip through. I knew I should call my usual exploration partner, or at the very least, tell someone where I was going. But the opportunity was too perfect to pass up. Armed with my camera, a flashlight, and a backpack full of supplies, I made my way to the factory under the cover of darkness. The gap in the fence was still there, an inviting portal to urban decay. I slipped through, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear. The factory loomed ahead, a massive hulk of rusted metal and shattered windows. Moonlight filtered through the gaps, casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown courtyard. I paused to take a few exterior shots before heading toward a side entrance. The door creaked open with surprising ease, as though it had been waiting for me. The smell hit me first, a musty combination of damp concrete, rusted metal, and something else I couldn't quite place. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness and revealing a vast open space filled with silent, forgotten machinery. I moved slowly, carefully, my camera at the ready. Every step echoed in the cavernous room, the sound bouncing off walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. I lost myself in the photography, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, the textures of decay, the forgotten stories of abandoned objects. I don't know how long I had been exploring when I first heard it. A soft sound, barely audible over my own movements. I paused, holding my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, a faint shuffling, like something being dragged across concrete. My first thought was that it must be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat that had found its way inside. But as I stood still, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, more purposeful. This wasn't an animal. I switched off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. My eyes struggled to adjust as I pressed myself against the wall, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It was coming from deeper within the factory, from a hallway I hadn't yet explored. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out while I still could. But curiosity, that damned human trait, got the better of me. I had to know what was making that sound. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept towards the hallway. The shuffling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I reached the entrance to the corridor and peered around the corner. My blood ran cold. There, at the far end of the hallway, was a figure, humanoid in shape but wrong somehow. Its proportions were off, limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles. It was facing away from me, its head cocked as if listening. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a stumble, I'm not sure. But suddenly it turned. In the dim light filtering through a broken window, I caught a glimpse of its face, or rather where a face should have been. Instead, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other. Then, with a sound that was part shriek and part static, it began to move towards me. I ran. I ran like I've never run before, my feet pounding against the concrete floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, that awful shuffling gait growing faster, closer. I burst out of the side entrance into the moonlit courtyard. The gap in the fence seemed miles away. I sprinted towards it, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for rest. Just as I reached the fence, I felt something brush against my back. I didn't look back, didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the gap, feeling the barbed wire tear at my clothes, at my skin. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked several blocks away. As I fumbled with my keys, I finally dared to look back. The street behind me was empty. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. Couldn't have been real. Maybe I'd breathed in some toxic fumes left over from the factory's operational days. Maybe the isolation and darkness had played tricks on my mind. But as I uploaded the photos from my camera, I realized with growing horror that it had been all too real. There, in the background of one of my shots, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. Long limbs, unnatural posture, and that smooth, featureless face. I deleted the photos, all of them. I scrubbed my hard drive, destroyed the memory card. I wanted no record of that night, no evidence of what I'd seen, but I can't erase the memory. Can't shake the feeling that I didn't just encounter something in that factory. I awakened it. And now, late at night when the world is quiet, I swear I can hear a faint shuffling outside my window. I don't go urban exploring anymore. Can't bring myself to enter abandoned buildings, even in broad daylight. Because now I know that sometimes the places we think are empty are anything but. Sometimes, in the forgotten corners of our world, things wait. Patient, hungry things that should not be. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, you might just catch their attention. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Tried to convince myself it was all in my head. A product of fear and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. I know that in that abandoned factory, I encountered something that defies explanation, something that shouldn't exist in our world. I've done research since then, diving deep into urban legends and conspiracy theories. I found whispers of similar encounters, stories of explorers who ventured into abandoned places and never returned or came back, changed. There are names for these entities: skinwalkers, wendigos, things that lurk in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. But names don't matter. What matters is that they're out there, waiting in the dark, empty corners of our world. And once you've seen them, once they've noticed you, you're never truly safe again. I moved away from the city after that night. I left it all behind. Now, I live in a small town, surrounded by people and light. But even here, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. That somewhere out there, that thing from the factory is still looking for me, waiting for its chance. So I keep my doors locked, my curtains drawn. I don't go out after dark, and I never, ever explore abandoned buildings. Because I've learned the hard way that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't the ghosts of the past lingering in those forgotten places. Sometimes It's the things that have always been there, lying in wait for someone foolish enough to disturb their slumber. If you're an urban explorer, if you feel drawn to the allure of abandoned places, heed my warning. Never go alone. Always trust your instincts. And if you hear something shuffling in the darkness, if you catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, run. Run and don't look back. Because once they see you, once they know you're there, it might already be too late. As for me, I'll keep running. I'll keep hiding. And I'll pray that one day the memory of that faceless figure will fade. That the sound of shuffling footsteps will no longer haunt my dreams. But deep down, I know the truth. Some things once seen can never be unseen. And some encounters change you forever, leaving you constantly looking over your shoulder. Forever wondering what lurks in the shadows of the world we thought we knew. My roommate was out of town for the week, so I had the place all to myself. It was spring break, and with no classes to attend, I had a free week ahead. On Monday, a huge storm rolled through the city, so I found myself stuck inside. This kind of weather was pretty common for this time of year, but it always felt worse whenever it hit. The trees outside looked like they might snap, and the house was constantly shaking and creaking. Knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep, I decided to stay up and play some video games. I got comfortable and played for over an hour, probably until about 11 o'clock, when suddenly the doorbell rang. I paused the game and stood up, but then remembered the storm. Who could be out there right now? I made my way to the front door and peeked through the peephole, but saw nothing. I opened the door, and the wind and rain hit me instantly. I looked around but didn't spot anyone. I shut the door, thinking maybe the wind had somehow triggered the doorbell. It sounded ridiculous now, but I didn't know what else to think. I returned to my game, but a few minutes later, I heard a loud crash from the backyard, something tumbling and breaking. I instantly recognized the sound of our patio furniture getting blown around. I ran to the back door. The furniture was all over the yard, being tossed by the wind. I quickly slipped on my shoes and ran outside to start putting everything back against the house. The wind was so fierce that it stung whenever the rain hit my face. I rushed to get everything in place when I saw someone standing at the edge of the backyard, watching me. I locked eyes with them for a moment, but then grabbed the last piece of furniture and ran inside, trying to escape the rain. I peeked out the back door once I was dry, but the person was gone. Between that and the strange doorbell ring, I started feeling uneasy. I went to the living room and decided to scroll on my phone to take my mind off things. Eventually, exhaustion hit, and I grabbed a blanket to lay on the couch. I didn't feel like going upstairs where the storm was louder anyway. It took some time, but I finally drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, the house shook from a burst of heavy wind. I sat up, pulled the blanket off, and moved to check if the furniture outside was still in place. But the moment my feet touched the floor, I realized they were wet. It woke me up completely. I looked down and saw a puddle forming on the floor next to the couch. Then I saw more puddles, each with faint muddy shoe prints leading across the room. My heart raced as I stood up and backed into the corner of the room, trying to process what I was seeing. After a minute of silence, I cautiously followed the shoe prints. They led throughout the house, upstairs and downstairs, and it was clear they had entered through the back door, which I had stupidly forgotten to lock in the rush of getting the furniture inside. I locked the door and grabbed my phone to call 911, but then the thought hit me, what if they were still in the house? I stayed quiet, moved to the furthest corner of the house where I felt hidden, and dialed. I waited in silence until the police arrived. They checked around the house, seeing everything I had noticed, but nothing else. They told me it looked like a personal attack since nothing had been taken, and the person seemed focused solely on my house. The weirdest part was when they walked right past me while I was sleeping, seemingly doing nothing but watching me. It felt incredibly creepy, but it didn't make much sense. If they wanted to do something to me, they would have acted at that moment. After thinking about it, I started to believe that whoever it was had actually been looking for my roommate. They saw me, searched the house, and then left without doing anything. So, If this was personal and my roommate had been there, things could have turned out much worse. The Big South Trail, established in 1908 by Theodore Roosevelt, is an 11-mile hiking path that weaves through the rugged Comanche Peak wilderness in Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. Experienced hikers often describe the trail as moderately challenging, with some sections where ledges are only about 24 inches wide. As one hiker noted, the terrain can be demanding, and if you're not in good shape, it'll drain your energy. Renowned for its stunning scenery, the trail is also a sanctuary for wildlife, home to elk, bobcats, black bears, mountain lions, and more. The average temperatures along the trail vary from warm summer highs in the upper 60s to bitterly cold winter lows of 10 to 15 degrees, making it suitable for both sunny and snowy activities. The area's untouched beauty is one of the reasons brothers Alan and Arland Atadero decided to establish the Pudra River Resort, a retreat for hikers and outdoor enthusiasts of all kinds. Alan often said that he and his brother spent so much time at the resort that they felt as though they were becoming part of the landscape itself. So it seemed natural to move their families out there. Life at the resort was peaceful until the fall of 1999, when a Christian singles group arrived to help Alan prepare for winter in exchange for free lodging. On October 2nd, the group decided to visit a nearby trout farm, just under 2 miles from the resort. Alan knew several members of the group well, and since his 6-year-old daughter, Jocelyn, wanted to join them, Alan knew his 3-year-old son, Jared, would want to go as well. Trusting the singles group, Alan gave them permission to take his children on the hike around 10 a.m. that morning. Eager for one of his first real outdoor adventures, Jared repeatedly ran ahead of the group, but no more than 100 feet at a time before one of his guardians would call him back. Around 11:30, the group stopped to chat with some fishermen whom little Jared had run into while leading the way. After a brief conversation, they continued on the trail. By this point, the group had begun to spread out, with some walking faster and others slower. At least one adult stayed with Jared's sister, while Jared, as usual, kept running ahead of everyone. Not long after, Jared rounded a bend in the trail and vanished from sight. Technically, he hadn't gone further ahead than usual, so his guardians weren't overly concerned. But when they reached the corner, there was no sign of him or the little beige coat he was wearing. One of the singles groups rushed ahead to try to find the boy, but he was nowhere to be found. And as it turned out, that last image of young Jared turning the blind corner on the trail was the last time anyone would see him alive. Over the following few days, a huge search and rescue operation was mounted, but not a single sign of Jared Atadero was found. In fact, it would take almost 4 years for any clues of his demise to be found, but these clues seemed to only raise many more questions than they answered. After searching for approximately an hour, a few members of the hiking group rushed back to the Pudra River Resort to give Alan the bad news that his 3-year-old son was lost in the woods. In a panic, Alan immediately drives out to meet the rest of the group, helping them continue to search for another hour or so. It is during this time that some of the 11-person hiking party say that they heard some kind of high-pitched scream, including Alan's 6-year-old daughter, Jocelyn. I asked her what kind of scream it was, like somebody getting attacked or somebody playing with someone, Alan later said. She said it sounded like a playful scream, as if someone was going up to tag him. Since it seemed like Jared was within earshot, the group continued to search intensively for him. But no matter how hard they tried, they just couldn't locate their lost toddler. So just before 4 o'clock that afternoon, Alan rushed back to the resort to call 911. Less than 30 minutes later, Larimer County Emergency Service Specialist, Bill Nelson, receives an emergency pager alert informing them that a child had gone missing on the Big South Trail. In turn, Bill contacts his search and rescue manager, who immediately musters multiple SAR teams to prepare for a large but delicate operation. Within 2 hours of the original 911 call being made, search and rescue personnel had boots on the ground at the lower Big South trailhead, with a total of 65 people involved in the search for Jared. An hour and a half into their search, rescue personnel had scoured the majority of the trail and still hadn't located Jared. As a result, The area of operations was vastly expanded with reinforcements, including Air Force helicopters, due to arrive the following morning. At 7 a.m. on October 2, 1999, the Cheyenne-based 1N Huey helicopter made its first pass over the Big South Trail and remained the search and rescue team's eye in the sky until late in the morning. After returning to Fort Collins Loveland Municipal Airport to refuel, the helicopter arrived back in the search area at around 3:30 that afternoon. However, during its second patrol over the trail, the helicopter struggled with the mountain conditions and stalled out, plummeting more than 100 feet before smashing through the pine canopy near the trailhead. Aboard the Huey were 4 USAF servicemen, but also a representative of the Larimer County Search and Rescue Team named Mark Sheets. When it crashed, Mark was the only passenger who was not securely in a seat, as he was on the floor with the door open. He said that when he saw the rotors hit the top of the trees and pieces of helicopters sprayed into the forest, he rushed to close the door, but a severed tree limb found its way into the hold and struck the Air Force doctor on board squarely in the face, fracturing the doctor's eye socket and causing blood to pour from an open wound. By some stroke of good luck, the Air Force crew was able to escape from the helicopter's wreckage, but Mark Sheets had been completely knocked out cold and was still trapped in the mass of crumbled metal that was still in danger of exploding. Nearby search and rescue members ran to the downed helicopter, smashed in the window, and managed to pull the unconscious Sheets out before he could come to any more harm. But he had still received a severe concussion and a 13-inch L-shaped gash that left his femur exposed. Mark had also suffered 3 broken vertebrae in his lower back and a broken shoulder, possibly from being pulled from the wreckage so violently. The helicopter crash most definitely set the search back a great deal, but thankfully, all survived and the search efforts continued into their 3rd day. Day 3 saw the arrival of specially trained police diving teams who explored the deep pools of the nearby Poudre River. Another helicopter was dispatched to aid the search, but encountered swirling winds that required full power to prevent crashing. This burned through the chopper's fuel supplies in no time, and it was soon forced to return to Fort Collins Air Force Base. Over the next 3 days, well-meaning but ill-equipped, the volunteers started hounding the Larimer County Sheriff's Office and Larimer County Search and Rescue to allow them to help. 3-year-old Jared had been missing for almost a week at that point, and time was running out to find him safely. They approved, and soon the number of search and rescue personnel had swelled to over 200 and included a dozen dog teams, professional trackers, a dive team, and a search plane. But even with all those bodies and assets, the search and rescue operation was a complete and utter failure, as not a single usable clue to Jared's whereabouts are found. Consequently, officials are forced to notify the Atadero family that the search for Jared had been suspended. Larimer County under Sheriff Bill Nelson hastily convened a press conference. In it, he told the gathered journalists, "We worked for 8 solid days to begin with, and that was 24 hours a day for 8 days. We did some night searching. It was limited to a certain extent, but we did always have people out in the field to make noise. So if somebody was out there now, Jared would have heard it. He would have maybe responded." Jean Kmiecki, a member of the Larimer County Search and Rescue Canine Unit, said that the search was one of the most intense she'd ever taken part of. She'd never been involved in the search for a child before, and although it was to be expected, she was astounded at the level of media coverage. "It became a real nationwide episode," she said. "So that put a lot of stress on us and a lot of stress on the dogs." County Sheriff Justin Smith was just a lowly sergeant back in 1999 when Jared went missing. He said the helicopter crash was an extremely stressful event, which most definitely had a negative effect at a crucial period of the search, and that the intense media interest only exacerbated the situation. It's worth knowing that this all took place right around the time that the grand jury of the JonBenet Ramsey case was due to hand down indictments. So the concept of children coming to harm loomed large in the national zeitgeist. Naturally, the media flocked to sate the public's appetite for answers, and at one point, 17 TV satellite trucks lined Colorado's Highway 14, and the area swarmed with reporters and camera crews, sporting fur coats to protect them from the bitter Colorado cold. Meanwhile, police information hotlines were buzzing with calls, including a number of self-proclaimed psychics who claimed they knew where SAR operators could find the terrified but still living Jared. TV crews observed a Native American medicine man visiting the area who informed them he had arrived to perform a kind of ritual in which he would ask the mountain to return the boy to his parents. And in one particularly unusual but wholesome incident, a barefoot man with a mule showed up on the trail and volunteered his services in the search effort. But as much as the gesture was a heartfelt one, dog teams and aircraft had failed to find any sign of Jared. So one more pair of eyes on the ground proved of little use. As much as it hurt them to do so, rescue volunteers were forced to call off their search entirely. And for years, the case of little Jared's disappearance remained a complete and utter mystery. Cut to June of 2003, when hikers Rob Osborne and Gareth Watts were making their visit to the Big South Trail. We singled out the Poudre Canyon as an area we'd like to explore, Rob said. So we decided on getting there via the Big South Trail. We'd heard how gorgeous a hike it was, how beautiful and wild the area around the river was. And since that's the whole reason Gary and I got into hiking, we figured we'd pay it a visit. While on their hike, Rob and Gareth wound up in a rock field and decided to hike up around 2,000 feet to reach its top. It's remarkable country up there, but it really was a scramble. Gareth later said, "You're constantly watching your feet. Focus on the area in front of you so you don't end up twisting an ankle or something." He and Rob had hiked areas in the vicinity before and were obviously aware of the Jared Atadero mystery owing to the amount of media attention it received. And as experienced outdoorsmen, they had spent one or two occasions theorizing on the cause of the boy's disappearance. We'd figured he'd been swept downstream, maybe taken by a mountain lion. Rob said, "Obviously, there was the possibility of something more sinister happening, but it's something we didn't really talk about. Having kids of our own, it just didn't bear thinking about." But since they were hiking the exact area that Jared had gone missing, the pair felt an eerie sense of dread and couldn't keep their minds off the mysterious and heartbreaking incident. But neither must have expected the discovery they were due to make that day. Rob and Gareth usually stuck to popular hiking trails mainly for safety purposes. But on that first visit to the Big South Trail with the thought of Jared's disappearance in their minds, they took it upon themselves to wander off the trail. "We didn't set out to find anything," Gareth added. "We figured if a whole team of guys couldn't find anything, there was no way we could. But I guess there was an element of what if, you know." Then about an hour into the hike, we just walked right into it. I couldn't believe my eyes at first, but there they were clear as day. Rob and Gareth had somehow stumbled across a set of child's clothes more than 500 feet of the trail from where he was last seen. "That's when I saw the shoe," Gareth said. "It was a kid's shoe, definitely, and it was pristine, like somebody had just took their foot right out of it, you know. Fresh, like you might look up and see a kid hopping around looking for their sneaker." But then the two hiking buddies found another matching shoe. A brown fleece jacket and a pair of blue sweatpants that had been turned inside out. In their eyes, there was no way these clothes could be Jared Atadero's. The boy had been missing almost 4 years by that time, and it wasn't conceivable that they could be exposed to elements for all this time. It still looked brand new, but still, just in case, the two men took photographs of the clothes and called 911 at the next available opportunity. They complied with the detective's request to email over the photographs they'd taken, which were then forwarded to Alan Atadero, who was living in Littleton at the time. The detective was stunned when he received a reply stating that the clothes did indeed belong to Jared. Within 24 hours, state authorities had assembled a team consisting of Larimer County Sheriff's Office members, Larimer County Search and Rescue officials, rangers from the Colorado Division of Wildlife, and volunteers from an organization known as NecroSearch. All were directed to meet at Big South Trailhead to start search for remains of Jared. Later, with Alan Atadero and personnel from the local Child Protection Network joining the search effort, they managed to recover the remains of the entire outfit that Jared was wearing on the day of his disappearance, which were scattered over a 25-foot area. While the cloth jacket had what appeared to be puncture marks and the pants were tattered, the nylon shoes had little weathering, leading investigators to conclude that some of the items were sheltered from the elements and some were exposed. It was the simplest explanation, but not necessarily the correct one. Then, at a site about 180 feet north and 20 feet higher in elevation than the place the clothing was found, police made a chilling discovery. It was a tiny piece of a human being's skull, wedged into a crevice and only barely visible with the naked eye. Nearby, on a log spanning the crevice where the skull fragment was found, Police also found a human tooth. At 5 p.m. that evening, Alan Adadero and other members of the search teams summoned throngs of TV news reporters to the trailhead and announced what he and the team had found. It was most definitely a breakthrough in the case, but again, the discovery only seemed to generate more questions than it answered. And it wasn't long before people were forced to come up with their own explanations. Canadian outdoorsman Les Survivorman Shroud said that whatever is happening up on the Big South Trail is simply beyond human comprehension. In a lot of these cases, search and rescue or the volunteer searching people have already gone over certain areas, not once, not twice, but even dozens of times, he said. And then the child is found there maybe a year, maybe a few years later. It makes no sense at all. I've been in and out in the woods for years now, and I've seen all kinds of things, but still I can't make sense of it all. Hacker Rob Osborne says there's a good chance the area where Jared's clothes were found wasn't searched during the initial effort, and that it was down to one simple thing. No way could a kid have climbed up to that spot on his own. No way. I mean, it was a struggle for Gary and I to get there. It was very rough terrain. So maybe the police should have searched that area the first time around. But at the same time, I can't blame them for rolling it out. Police dog handler Jane Chmiewski's conclusion from the get-go was that Jared's disappearance was due to an animal encounter. I'm not sure officially what has really been released as a finality, but it pretty much points to an animal encounter. Nothing else explains how he could have been dragged up so high. Unless, of course, it was a person that took Jared that morning. This was where SAR specialist Bill Nelson's testimony gets a little frightening. If a big cat actually took him, which is what I believe happened, it would have taken him someplace and buried him, he said. With all the activity that was going on, we probably scared it away. Then it would have come back later to dig up its meal. That's why no one found nothing. The kid was on the ground the whole time. But then surely volunteers or police would have noticed some disturbed earth somewhere, and Jared's clothing must have showed some signs of animal attack. It's inconsistencies like those that make Alan Adadero think something else is to blame for his son's disappearance. I hear constantly about a mountain lion, he said, but when they tested Jared's clothes, there was no mountain lion hairs, no DNA, no blood, nothing on his clothes. If a mountain lion would have attacked him, they would have gone for the stomach area. His jacket would have been threads, but his jacket was fine. I've talked to wildlife experts about this, Alan said, quick to reassure those who will listen. Jared's jacket would not have survived a mountain lion attack. His shoes that were found up in the mountain, as told by investigators, do not look like they were in the wilderness for years. I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. Alan also points out the peculiar nature of the discovery of Jared's shoes. They were almost completely untouched, which seemed unusual if he had been dragged up the side of a mountain by a mountain lion, as some had initially speculated. His pants were found in good condition, showing only slight damage from birds and rodents that may have used the threads for nesting. For a large predator to have attacked him, it would have likely torn through his clothes to feed, yet there were no signs of that kind of damage. One of the reports Alan read suggested that the reason forensic examiners couldn't find any DNA or blood on Jared's clothes was that either he or something had removed his clothing before he was attacked. Imagining how horrified Alan must have been upon reading that detail is hard to grasp. That was the last thing Alan wanted to read. The report went on to claim that because so many hikers had been in the area, the mountain lion must have taken Jared and then carried his body 500 feet up the cliff. However, the question remains. If someone or something had removed Jared's clothes before the attack, why were the clothes found around 500 feet up the mountain? His pants were found inside out, a clear sign they had been hurriedly pulled off, not torn by claws or teeth. These small details are what led Alan and his family to believe that someone may know more about what happened and is simply unwilling to share. Jared's disappearance has never been fully explained by law enforcement or the various amateur investigators who have looked into it. For those who believe in the mountain lion theory, it's important to remember that since 1915, there have only been 14 fatal mountain lion attacks reported in the US and Canada. The likelihood of an attack is incredibly low, and even less likely when considering that Jared was part of a large group of hikers. These hikers were thoroughly questioned by the police, as it seemed natural that at least one of them would have had some involvement in his disappearance. However, multiple homicide detectives stated that interviews with the group revealed no obvious red flags, and no evidence pointed to any of them being responsible. This has led to a variety of wild theories trying to explain the mystery, everything from cryptid attacks to alien abductions. But despite all the theories circulating, none of them seem to stick. As more time passes, it seems increasingly likely that the disappearance of young Jared Atadero will remain an unsolved and heartbreaking mystery. Last year, I was house sitting for one of my best friends. They had a few lizards and fish that I needed to feed, as well as several houseplants to water. They were away on a 2-week business trip, so I agreed to take care of everything for them. Their house was much nicer than my apartment, so I was happy to do it. The first week went smoothly, and it felt almost like staying in an Airbnb. But then, one night while sitting at the kitchen table, I heard a man cough right outside the house. It startled me because it was so close, right outside the back door. I quickly turned on the outdoor lights to show I was home and waited a minute before peeking out the window. Whoever had been there was gone, but I couldn't help but wonder why they were even there in the first place. I stayed on edge for the rest of the night, but nothing else happened. It was a little after 7 p.m., and I hadn't eaten yet, so I decided to step out to grab some food. As I walked out, I noticed footprints in the yard. The grass was flattened, and there was a clear path where someone had walked. I followed the prints, which led from the sidewalk to the back of the house and then back again. I shrugged it off and went for food, but it kept nagging at me while I was driving. I couldn't think of any reason why someone would do that. It just seemed pointless. When I got back, I checked the yard again for more footprints, but I didn't find anything. I went inside, sat down, and turned on the TV. After about an hour, I felt myself getting sleepy, so I turned it off and climbed into bed, scrolling through my phone for a bit. That's when I heard someone outside again. They were walking across the front yard, then went around to the back door. I stood still, listening as they moved around back like they were trying to open the door. I quickly got up, alert now, and flicked the light switch at the top of the stairs, turning on the downstairs lights. The person immediately stopped. I crept down a few steps, leaning over the railing to peer at the back door. But when I looked, nobody was there. That made me feel even more unsettled. Just a few seconds later, I heard a window shatter, and glass flew across the living room. I couldn't see what was happening from where I was, but I immediately ran upstairs and into the bedroom. I heard a few coughs, then the crunching of glass as someone stepped inside. Once they were in, all hell broke loose. It was like they were knocking everything over, smashing things, and breaking anything they could find. I quickly called the police, but I feared they wouldn't arrive in time. After wreaking havoc downstairs, the intruder ran up the stairs, breaking things in one of the spare bedrooms, before heading to the room I was in. He tried the door, but I had locked it. Instead of leaving, he began smashing something against it, trying to break it down. One of the door panels nearly flew off, and that's when he reached in and unlocked it. The man stepped inside, wearing a face mask and a hoodie, holding a metal baseball bat. I froze in the corner, fighting back tears as he glared at me with rage. But instead of coming toward me, he started destroying everything in the room, smashing furniture, the walls, anything in his path. He didn't acknowledge me at all. He moved past me, destroying the room as fast as he could, before running into the next room. Then, he finally went downstairs and left the house. I stayed frozen in place until the police arrived. My friend came home early the next day to find the house completely trashed, but nothing had been stolen. The police suspected the person was someone my friend knew and had a vendetta against her, but she couldn't think of anyone who would do something like this. I tried to give a description of the man, but with his face masked and his hoodie on, I wasn't much help. The most terrifying part was how he completely ignored me, acting completely unbothered by my presence. To this day, no one knows who he was or what he wanted, and he hasn't been back to my friend's house since. The whole experience still haunts me. Around 3 years ago, I stayed at an Airbnb, though there wasn't any special occasion, just a much-needed weekend to unwind from work. The cabin was located about 4 hours from my hometown in a remote area. There weren't many neighbors, just a handful of other cabins within a mile or so, with dense woods right behind the place. It was exactly what I had hoped for, and I was thrilled. I arrived early in the morning and spent some time exploring the property, taking in the cool features. Later, I sat outside on the back patio in a swinging chair, enjoying the view. While I was there, I noticed a man walking through the woods. He looked like an average guy, so I assumed he must be staying at one of the nearby cabins. He wandered deeper into the woods until I lost sight of him, and I went back to relaxing. I stayed outside for nearly an hour before going inside to cook dinner and unwind with a movie later in the evening. That's when the doorbell rang. I didn't even realize the cabin had one, but I went ahead and answered the door. It was the man I had seen earlier standing on the porch. He told me he'd been lost for a few hours and needed help finding his cabin. I had a strange feeling about him, but I couldn't put my finger on what was off. I told him I'd get my phone so he could look up his cabin's address. I closed the door, went to grab my phone, and when I came back to the door, he was gone. Vanished, nowhere in sight. I stood at the door for a moment, then shut it and returned to the couch, feeling uneasy. I didn't know what to make of the whole situation, but I tried to brush it off and eventually went to bed. I slept soundly, but the next morning, I went outside to enjoy my coffee on the back porch. Only 10 minutes passed before I saw something unsettling. The same man from the day before, walking in the woods again, exactly in the same spot. At that point, I was certain he wasn't lost. But why did he come to my cabin? I went back inside and called a friend, telling them about the weird situation. It was comforting to talk it out with someone else, but then something happened that almost gave me a heart attack. The doorbell rang again. I whispered to my friend and kept the call going while I went to check the door. I asked, "Do you need something?" The man smiled and repeated his story about being lost and needing help. Confused and irritated, I stared at him, but then he spoke again. "Can you get your phone and search for the address?" My blood ran cold when he said that. I quickly slammed the door shut, updating my friend, who immediately told me to leave right away. I hurried to pack my bags and made sure to check the peephole to see if the man was still outside. Once I was sure he wasn't there, I rushed to my car, packed my stuff in the back seat, and began to pull out. As I was backing up, I saw him, standing inside the house, watching me through the front window. My heart dropped. When I got home, I contacted the Airbnb host and explained what had happened. His response was brief, and he didn't seem concerned at all, just apologized for my negative experience. I'll never understand what his intentions were, but the sight of him standing inside the house, not even a minute after I'd left, still haunts me to this day. It was by far the creepiest, most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. It was New Year's Eve in 2009, heading into 2010. I went to visit a friend who was studying at a nearby university. Her house was just a street away from where I had lived for the first 7 years of my life, so I knew the area fairly well. There were 4 of us girls, but only myself and the university girl were familiar with the area. Her house sat at the edge of a walled park, which was locked from dusk until dawn. On the other side of the park was the main city, including the university itself, along with most of the pubs, clubs, and nightlife. To get from one side to the other, you'd have to go around the park, which was mostly well lit. We'd spent the night out celebrating New Year's, and by that point, we were all pretty drunk. The lightweights were completely smashed, and the normally sensible ones of us were hiccuping, stumbling, and expressing love for everyone. The university girl was the typical messy drunk, but she seemed to be keeping it together. Both she and I were stumbling and noticeably intoxicated. We decided to take the route over the park because it was a little quicker. As we walked, we passed an alleyway opening where we saw a man standing still in the middle of the lane about 30 yards away. He wasn't on his phone, nor was he with anyone. He was just standing there, stock still in dark, nondescript clothes, directly in the middle of the empty alley, facing us. The university girl and I exchanged glances, and we both immediately sensed something wasn't right. Sensible girl, drunkenly oblivious, thought it would be a great idea to shout "Happy New Year" at the top of her lungs and wave enthusiastically at him. The university girl and I quickly pulled her away from the alley and hurried the group forward. The university girl asked if I thought he was following us, and my heart sank. I turned around and saw that he had left the alley and was now walking behind us. We quickened our pace. At that moment, the university girl and I realized the situation. We were closer to the front entrance of her house, which was part of a long row of terraced houses. But that meant the man who had started walking behind us and was closing the gap would likely know where we were going. We decided to take the risk and went around the back of the house, managing to lose him before we reached the alley entrance. We were relieved he wouldn't know exactly where we had gone or which house we were staying in. Once we were safely inside, we got the lightweight and sensible girl settled and began peeking out the window curtains to check the street. That's when we saw him. He was pacing up and down the road on the other side, clearly looking into windows and examining the lights still on in the houses. We panicked and called the non-emergency police line to report what had happened. They sent a car around the block, and after that, we saw the man quickly disappear. The next morning, we told the other two about what had happened. They had no idea how close we had been to real danger. We had the TV on in the background when the local news came on. The story was about a girl who had gotten separated from her friends while drunk and had been attacked and raped on the very same road where we'd first seen the man. We were all shaken by what could have happened to us. The second part occurred when I happened to move back to the area in February 14th. By then, I'd totally forgotten about this episode, so I was trying to settle into my job, which had brought me back to the area. I was again on the other side of the park, this time at the bottom, and my new house was a few roads back from where the uni girls had been. So I basically would walk the same road every day to and from work, through the park during the daytime and along the lower wall of the park at night. I would work late on Sundays with my hour rota until 11 p.m., but often I wouldn't leave to walk home until 12, 1, or even 2. It was a shit job. They kept putting me in on Friday and Saturday nights, which I didn't mind at all. But then 2 Saturdays in a row, I felt like I was being followed by someone. Though both times I was able to go into a shop to lose them, or to get a friend who lived on their way to come outside their house and chat with me until the person following me turned around or went a different way. I wasn't routed for weekends for a little bit, so it didn't escalate. And it didn't happen on weekdays, so I thought I was being paranoid. A couple of months later, however, I stayed late at work on a Friday again. It was around 1:30. I was exhausted and ready for bed. I was sleepily wandering my way home, not really paying attention to my surroundings, when a man from the other side of the road crossed towards me. I was immediately alert, wondering what he wanted. He asked me if I had a light, but I said no. I didn't smoke and kept walking. He kept going in the opposite direction behind me, but then I heard his feet turn and his footsteps followed behind mine. I just kept walking. Maybe he was going home for a light. I took my next turn, and sure enough, so did he. We were walking alongside a fairly busy main road, well lit, which had cars going next to it every few minutes. But I was about to turn into a much quieter residential area, where the lights were less frequent and there wouldn't be cars going past unless going into a house. Not wanting to be paranoid, I decided to do a test on whether this guy was just innocently heading home or actually had another purpose for turning around behind me. This was, by the way, when my brain decides to remind me that we are literally walking right past the house where the first incident occurred. I turned into the residential area. The first building on the right is a funeral home, which has 2 carports in the back where they keep the hearses. I scooted down past the house, barely not breaking into a full-on run, and I hid in one of the carports, sticking my head out of the shadow to watch if he'd first follow me into the residential area and secondly, if he'd just walk straight past the little alley I was hiding in. Sure enough, he turned into the residential area. He walked halfway across the alley opening, then visibly began searching for me in the 2 directions I could have gone. If I'd have kept walking, I would have been very visible. Instead, he gave up after a few seconds of just walking back and forward. He shrugged his shoulders and began walking back from where he came. I went home, shaken by what I'd seen, and asked my bosses if I could possibly not work late Fridays and Saturdays because I'd been followed recently on 3 occasions. Their response was that it would not be possible to get preferential treatment, and so, if I wanted to be safe, they recommended I take a taxi, which they wouldn't pay for and would cost me an hour's pay for a 2-minute drive as I lived only a 12-minute walk away from my workplace. Needless to say, I quit shortly after. I've been going on backpacking and camping trips for years, exploring different trails around the Appalachian Range in lower West Virginia. My best friend, who lives just a few miles away, would often join me on these hikes. We usually planned one big trail every fall, anywhere from a few days to a whole week of backpacking and camping. In 2019, we planned to take a trail across the range to a small lake at the top of the mountains, but just before the trip, my friend had to cancel because of a work emergency. Since I had already taken the whole week off and had everything ready, I decided to go alone. On Monday morning, I drove to a nearby trailhead and began my journey. This wasn't a regular recreational trail like the ones for short, easy hikes. These backpacking trails didn't have defined paths, so you had to rely on maps, compasses, and landmarks to navigate. You'd hike toward a large landmark like a rock formation, and once you reached it, you'd spot the next landmark and so on. I spent the first 2 days hiking toward a ridge in the mountains. On the second day, when it got dark, I set up camp several hours away from the ridge. I pitched my tent, started a fire, and heated up some food. By 8 p.m., after the sun had set, I was in my tent reading. I left the fire burning, planning to put it out before going to sleep. About 20 minutes into reading, I heard the sharp sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. I jumped up, thinking it was a black bear, probably attracted by the food I had cooked. But then everything went silent. I crawled out of the tent and shined my flashlight into the tree line behind me. There was nothing. I called out loudly, hoping to scare off any animals, but still, no sound. It was strange because the stick snapping was so clear, like something had stepped on it. I stayed outside for a while, looking around, but didn't see anything. I eventually put out the fire and went back inside my tent, but I had trouble sleeping that night, focusing too much on listening for more sounds. The next morning, I was surprised I even managed to sleep through the night. I packed up my tent and gear and continued hiking toward the ridge. Once I reached it, it was a straight shot to the lake. I was moving fast to get there before sunset, hoping to avoid setting up camp again. I made it to the lake with about an hour to spare before the sun dipped below the horizon. The lake was beautiful, well worth the hike. I spent some time walking around, taking in the scenery, then set up my camp on the tree line beside the water. As I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept hearing soft noises coming from the trees behind me. It sounded almost like footsteps, but I knew no one else was out there. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the unease lingered. As I walked around the lake, I noticed I didn't see any other tents. It was too dark by this point to see much beyond a few feet, so looking around further wasn't an option. About an hour later, I got into my tent and laid down. Every few minutes, I'd hear footsteps again, just quiet enough that I couldn't tell for sure what they were. Eventually, I got so exhausted that I fell asleep. What I think was only an hour later, I woke up to the sound of someone running away from my tent. My heart raced as I jolted up, grabbed my flashlight, and rushed outside to see where the footsteps were headed. In the distance, I saw someone's bare back as they ran away. I stood there, frozen, and realized there were footprints all around my tent, as if someone had been walking around it, possibly even searching my campsite. Panic set in, and I tried to get the campfire going again as quickly as I could to get some light. I was terrified. There was nowhere to go and no one to help. I stayed by the fire all night, my head constantly swiveling, but I never saw or heard anything else. When the sun came up, I took a few photos of the lake before packing up and heading back. I had planned to stay the entire day, but I didn't feel safe anymore, like I was being followed. Thankfully, I made it back without further trouble. But as I was hiking back, I started to notice small things missing from my backpack. Food, a few tools, and other little items. The strange part was that I always had my bag with me. Even today, I can't shake the thought that whoever was outside my tent that night might have snuck inside and taken those things while I was asleep. The thought of it still sends a chill through me. This unsettling event took place on New Year's Eve in 2013. That night, I went out with a few friends to a downtown restaurant club for a New Year's celebration. I'd been feeling unwell all day, but still decided to join them at the party. As the clock neared midnight, I couldn't ignore how bad I was feeling any longer. So I told my friends I was heading home. The parking lot was quite dark, so I took out a small flashlight I had in my pocket to light the way. As I rounded the corner of the building, I heard a noise coming from my left, between two parked cars. When I approached the area, I shined my flashlight in the direction of the sound and saw a man crouched down on the ground. I asked him if he needed help, partly out of suspicion, and he replied that he did. He told me he had dropped his keys and couldn't find them in the dark, asking if I could shine my light so he could spot them. Everything seemed normal, so I decided to put my doubts aside and assist him. I crouched down beside him as we searched under the car. A few minutes passed, but we still hadn't found the keys. I switched places with the man, directing the beam of light under the next car. As I bent down further to shine the light, I suddenly felt a sharp crack to the back of my head. I remember the sensation of my face hitting the ground, but everything went blank for a moment. I was probably only out for a few seconds because when I started to regain consciousness, I felt someone flipping me over onto my back. As I opened my eyes, I saw a stranger rifling through my pockets. He had just pulled my wallet from my back pocket and handed it over to the man I had been helping. Then, I watched as the stranger pulled a pocket knife from my front pocket and flicked it open. It was one of those assisted opening knives that snapped open quickly, like a switchblade. He started waving it in front of my face and taunted me, asking what I planned to do about it. It wasn't a large knife, maybe 3 inches long, and I carried it more as a tool for everyday tasks, like opening boxes at work. I'd never thought of it as a weapon until that moment. Even though the knife wasn't huge, it was sharp enough to cut my throat. I couldn't respond to him. Despite being fully awake, I was too terrified to do anything. He continued to wave the knife and laugh. Thankfully, a group of men and women had just arrived and saw what was happening. One of the men yelled out, "What are you dudes doing to him?" They must have been afraid of the number of people in the group and ran off down the street. A couple of the guys checked me out to make sure I was okay while the others called 911. The first responders arrived a few minutes later and I went to the ER in the meat wagon. I was happy to hear I only had a slight concussion and would be allowed to go home later that morning. A female in the group had been kind enough to go into the club and tell my friends what had occurred, and they arrived soon after I did. They cut me loose with nothing more than a headache a few hours later, and I got a ride home with one of my friends. I spoke to the police briefly that night to give them a report, but it wasn't until the following day when I got any information. My knife had been found across the parking lot from where I had been assaulted, but I never got it back because it was evidence in an open investigation. They had also found my wallet down the street from the club, but nothing was in it. The iPhone I was carrying at the time never surfaced, but I had insurance on it and got another a few days later. I still have no idea where the flashlight went to. The 2 guys that assaulted me still haven't been found, and I don't expect they ever will be. The incident had me pretty messed up for a few years, but I eventually realized I was still alive, and that was the most important thing. Despite this, I'll probably never be able to come to the assistance of another person I don't know without being very afraid. Just to be safe, I think I'll mind my own business from now on. Better safe than sorry, you know? One 4th of July weekend in 2011, a buddy of mine, who I'll call Todd, found himself in a rather strange situation. This is the story he shared with me. The plan was for a fun weekend at a cabin up in the woods, hosted by Todd's friend, Troy. Troy had invited a girl over to introduce to Todd. So naturally, Todd was looking forward to some trouble for the holiday weekend. As luck would have it, Todd hit it off with his new date, and they quickly retreated downstairs to get some privacy. Soon after they disappeared downstairs, Troy decided to head out for a while. A little later, as Todd and his date were getting cozy, Troy returned to the cabin with some unexpected company. Upon hearing unfamiliar voices upstairs, Todd went up to check who had arrived. To his surprise, Troy had brought home a guy named Ace, who Todd couldn't stand. Seeing Ace instantly angered Todd, and a heated argument broke out between Todd and Troy while Ace awkwardly stood in the doorway. Troy's girlfriend walked in just then, standing next to Ace with a confused look on her face. Todd had originally rushed upstairs in his boxers, thinking it was just the guys who'd shown up. He and Troy quickly went back downstairs to continue arguing. Eventually, the argument started to die down, and Troy decided to cool off by taking his girlfriend and Ace for a swim in a nearby creek. For some reason, Troy grabbed Todd's shorts to swim in, which had Todd's keys, wallet, and cigarettes in the pockets. It wasn't until a few minutes later that Todd realized what had happened. Todd and his date stayed downstairs for a while until Troy, Ace, and Troy's girlfriend returned to the cabin. Right as Todd heard them coming back, he went upstairs to confront Troy. Furious, Todd demanded his shorts back and started yelling about his belongings in the pockets while Troy was swimming. The argument dragged on for a while, with Troy's girlfriend, Todd's date, and Ace trying to stay out of it, practically blending into the background. As Todd insisted that Troy take off his shorts right then and there, Troy refused, saying he wasn't going to strip down in front of everyone. That's when Ace decided to step in and back Troy up, making the argument even worse. Ace, knowing Todd had a reputation for being a tough guy and not one to lose a fight, jumped in to stand with Troy. After some more arguing, Troy and his girlfriend left again, still wearing Todd's shorts. Ace stayed behind for some reason, possibly because Troy had left without his backpack, which contained all his important personal items. Eventually, Todd and his date went back downstairs to continue their evening. Ace stayed upstairs, keeping company with Todd's pit bull. Everyone expected Troy and his girlfriend to return later that night, at least for his backpack. But when everyone woke up the next morning, they realized that Troy and his girlfriend had never come back to the cabin. Everyone was puzzled as to what Troy was up to, but since Troy had left his cell phone in his backpack, they all just hung around the cabin and waited for Troy. The second night came and went with no word from Troy or his girlfriend. It wasn't until they got up on the third day with still no Troy that they finally really started to worry. Alarm bells were definitely going off for the trio. Todd decided to try and call Troy's girlfriend again, like he had the previous day when her phone seemed to be switched off. That day it finally rang and she picked up. Fear crept into her voice when she realized that Troy wasn't back at the cabin like she assumed he would have been. So her and Todd agreed to start calling around to see if they could track down Troy, but no one had heard from Troy at all. Next, a panicking Todd called a few friends up to the isolated cabin to help search the nearby woods for Troy. Not a single trace of Troy was found. It was Todd who made the decision to call Troy's girlfriend and have her report Troy missing. She did just that, but when asked of Troy's last known whereabouts, she gave them the honest answer. She told them that Troy was last seen at his cabin having a heated argument with Todd. The problem with that was that Todd had a pretty well-known reputation for fighting. At this point in which the following events took place, Troy had been missing for 3 days, so he was declared lost at that point. Apparently, the cops decided they should take it seriously. The following morning, Todd, his date, and Ace were fast asleep, only to be startled awake to the sounds of both the front door being kicked in and people running around seemingly on the roof. The SWAT team flooded in, subduing the trio inside. At one point, one of the SWAT officers said, "I will kill you and I will kill the dog." Upon hearing that, Ace suddenly popped his face up from the floor and exclaimed, "Why would you do that?" Of course, the dog did not get hurt at all. What came next was the trio getting questioned by a couple of detectives portraying in the usual good cop, bad cop scenario. Unfortunately for Todd, though, he was the last person seen with Troy, and they were arguing. Couple that with Todd's reputation for fighting and well, that made Todd the number one and only suspect in Troy's disappearance. It also didn't help that the detectives had found some clothing left by the hot tub, and some of the clothing had drops of blood on it, though Todd insisted that he didn't even know whose clothes they were. Search and rescue came in next to comb the surrounding woods for clues to Troy's whereabouts. They searched for hours while Todd, Ace, and Todd's date were still being questioned, but they focused mainly on Todd. After a couple of hours of interrogation, Todd finally got irritated and insisted that since Troy had been missing for 3 days at that point, He could either be dead or alive, but they should be focusing their efforts on finding Troy. Oblivious to Todd and company was the fact that search and rescue had located Troy deep in the woods and hours away from his cabin. Troy was found passed out on a large rock, naked and just hours away from his demise. The next thing that Todd, his date, Ace, and the detectives heard was the sound of the search and rescue helicopter's chopper blades cutting through the air and getting closer to the cabin. As they peered out the door, they saw the approaching chopper with Troy suspended in a blue diaper-like thing from it. The chopper was looking for a safe place to lower Troy enough for emergency ground personnel to be able to reach him. As the smoke was still clearing on the whole situation a couple of days later, Todd was informed about the facts that led up to Troy's disappearance. Apparently, Troy and his girlfriend left the cabin on the night he vanished to simply cool off after the argument with a nice walk in the woods that surrounded the cabin. But right after they had left for the walk, Troy's girlfriend had stolen his debit card. Shortly after setting out on their walk, Troy and his girlfriend got into an argument themselves. They got separated after that, and Troy's girlfriend ended up walking herself back to the main road where she had called a ride, leaving Troy in the woods and assuming that he would find his way back to the cabin. So basically, Troy's girlfriend turned her phone off for the next couple of days in order to avoid Troy's angry phone calls about his debit card while she partied the whole time. When she did finally turn her phone back on, she received Todd's concerned call about Troy. She was shocked to learn that Troy had been missing for the last couple of days. Troy ended up being relatively okay, considering the circumstances. Todd ended up moving out of state shortly after, which pretty much dissolved the friendship. As far as Ace, Todd's date, and Troy's girlfriend, well, they're in the wind, I guess you could say. I'm almost positive, though, that none of the people involved in this story will ever be able to forget about the events that took place over those fateful 3 days at the cabin. The taste of freedom is sweetest when it's been taken away from you. I never truly understood that until I found myself behind bars in a foreign country, desperately trying to prove my innocence in a system built to assume guilt. It was supposed to be just another routine business trip to Moscow. As a senior executive for a multinational tech company, I'd made countless similar trips. Fly in, close the deal, fly out, simple, efficient, and usually quite dull. This time, though, would be far from routine. The first few days went smoothly. Meetings were productive, the local team was eager, and everything seemed to be on track to finalize a major contract. To celebrate our progress, Victor, one of the company's executives, invited me to dinner at an upscale restaurant. The food was exquisite, the vodka flowed freely, and the conversation was lively. Victor was especially interested in our company's latest innovations. In hindsight, maybe a little too interested, but in the moment, fueled by good food and alcohol, I thought nothing of it. I even showed him some confidential documents on my tablet, eager to impress our potential partners. As we said our goodbyes that night, Victor gave me a warm handshake. "To a successful partnership," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. I should have noticed something was off, sensed that unease, but I was too caught up in the excitement of nearly closing the deal. The next morning, I was jolted awake by loud banging on my hotel room door. Before I could even process what was happening, the door flew open, and several police officers rushed in, shouting in rapid Russian. Disoriented and still groggy, I didn't resist as they roughly handcuffed me and began rifling through the room. One officer held up my tablet, saying something that sounded accusatory. Another officer shoved a document in my face, an arrest warrant, though I couldn't understand the Cyrillic script. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. "This has to be a mistake." One officer, his face stern, responded in heavily accented English. "You are under arrest for theft of company secrets. Come with us now." My mind reeled. Theft, company secrets. This had to be a misunderstanding. But as they led me out of the hotel in handcuffs, the seriousness of the situation began to sink in. Passers-by stared, some taking photos with their phones. I felt exposed, vulnerable, my world crumbling around me. At the police station, things went from bad to worse. The interrogation room was small and stuffy, with harsh fluorescent lighting that made my head pound. 2 detectives questioned me for hours, their English limited and my Russian non-existent. They accused me of stealing proprietary information from the Russian company we were partnering with, claiming they had evidence on my tablet. I tried to explain that I had only shown Victor some basic information, nothing proprietary. But they didn't believe me, or perhaps didn't want to believe me. They showed me documents I had never seen before, alleging they were found on my device. When I denied knowledge of them, the detectives grew angry, their questions more aggressive. As the interrogation dragged on, I asked repeatedly to contact the US. Finally, exhausted and overwhelmed, I was thrown into a holding cell. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. I was alone in a foreign country, accused of a crime I didn't commit, with no idea how to prove my innocence. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and fear. I was moved to a larger prison, processed, and assigned to a crowded cell. The other inmates eyed me warily, a foreigner, clearly out of place in this harsh environment. It was 3 days before I was finally allowed to contact the US Embassy. The consular officer who visited me looked concerned, but could offer little immediate help. "We'll do what we can," she said, "but you need to understand that the Russian legal system works differently from ours. This could take time. That was something I suddenly had too much of, yet not enough. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. My company initially supported me, hiring a local lawyer to handle my case. But as time dragged on and negative publicity mounted, their support waned. Eventually, they distanced themselves from me entirely, claiming they had no knowledge of my illegal activities. My lawyer, a tired-looking man named Dmitry, did his best, but it was clear he was fighting an uphill battle. "The evidence against you is strong," he told me during one of our meetings. "Those documents on your tablet, they're very damaging." "But I've never seen those documents before," I protested. "Someone must have planted them." Dmitry sighed. "Proving that will be difficult. In cases like these, the courts tend to favor the prosecution." As my trial date approached, I fell into despair. The possibility of spending years in a Russian prison loomed over me like a dark cloud. I thought of my family back home, my career in tatters, my life as I knew it over. But then, a glimmer of hope. During one of our meetings, Dmitry's eyes lit up with an idea. "The restaurant," he said, "where you had dinner with Victor, did it have security cameras?" I nodded, not sure where he was going with this. "If we can get that footage, we might be able to prove that Victor had access to your tablet. It's a long shot, but it could cast doubt on the prosecution's case." It was a slim chance, but it was all we had. Dmitry worked tirelessly to secure the footage, battling bureaucracy and reluctant restaurant owners. Finally, just days before the trial, we got lucky. The footage clearly showed Victor handling my tablet while I was distracted by a phone call. In the courtroom, I sat nervously as Dmitry presented our case. He argued passionately that I was the victim of a setup, possibly industrial espionage. The security footage, while not conclusive proof of my innocence, was enough to plant seeds of doubt. The trial dragged on for weeks. Every day was a test of endurance, sitting through hours of testimony in a language I didn't understand, trying to glean what I could from my lawyer's hurried translations. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge rendered his verdict, not guilty. The words washed over me like a wave, relief flooding every fiber of my being. I was free. The nightmare was over. But as I walked out of the courthouse, blinking in the bright Moscow sunlight, I realized that free was a relative term. My reputation was in tatters. My career likely unsalvageable. The company I had worked tirelessly for had turned its back on me, and the experience had left scars that ran deep, both emotionally and psychologically. As I boarded the plane back to the States, I was overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also a searing anger at the injustice I had endured, and a lingering fear of what the future might hold. The Moscow skyline faded beneath the clouds, taking with it a chapter of my life I would never forget. Back home, I attempted to rebuild. It wasn't easy. Job interviews often ended as soon as the topic of my Russian ordeal came up. Friends, and even some family seemed uncertain how to approach me, as if my experience had changed me at a core level. In time, I started my own consulting firm, using my lessons learned to guide other businesses through the pitfalls of international partnerships. I became an advocate for reform in international business law, sharing my story as a cautionary tale. Though years have passed, the memories of those months spent in a Russian prison still haunt me. Sometimes, I wake up in a cold sweat, my mind trapped once again in that cramped cell. The sound of keys jingling still sends a jolt of panic through me. Yet, through it all, I've gained something invaluable. A deeper appreciation for freedom, for justice, and for the importance of integrity in both business and life. I learned the hard way that sometimes the cost of success can be far too high. Now, when I travel for business, I'm far more cautious. I protect information carefully, trust sparingly, and always stay alert, because I've seen firsthand how quickly a routine business trip can spiral into a desperate fight for freedom and justice in a foreign land. I grew up just north of New York City, in a densely populated metropolitan area. Every summer, I looked forward to the backpacking trips my father and I would take upstate. We had a spot about an hour north of Lake George in the Adirondacks where we camped for a few nights each summer. One particular trip, a few years ago now, we were driving to the trailhead. It was a long, narrow dirt road, and we saw a car pulled over with a few people arguing outside. It wasn't the most remote area, so it wasn't unusual to see another family, but this was strange because there was no real access to any trails in the area. As we got closer, a man walked over and waved at us. We thought they might be having car trouble, so my father rolled down the window. Suddenly, a woman in the group screamed, "Get away from him!" The man's expression changed instantly to something serious, and he began sprinting toward us. He was tall, well-built, and moving fast. My father quickly slammed on the brakes and reversed the car, and the man stopped and let out a sigh. We sat there, parked and confused, trying to process what had just happened. The man reached out towards us, but we were a good 10 yards away. Then he darted off the road and into the woods. Cautiously, we drove slowly up to the parked car, and we saw 3 women crying. Apparently, they were his sisters, and he had just returned home from the army a few months before. According to the women, after his return, he started acting strangely. He was diagnosed with PTSD, as well as early-onset Alzheimer's disease. The women got back into their car and headed to town, saying they were going to the ranger station for help locating him. The rest of the day was uneventful. We hiked to our campsite, fished for a while, and set up camp for the night. However, as we sat by the fire, my father and I started to feel uneasy. We weren't sure whether the women were telling the truth or if the man was just asking for help. What was even more disturbing was that we were camping only a few miles away from where he had run off. We couldn't help but wonder if he was violent, armed, or even if he had followed us. Usually, my father and I slept in separate tents, but that night we decided to stay in the shelter together. The shelter was a small log cabin with 3 walls and an open front where the fire pit was. Neither of us slept much that night, and while it could have just been my imagination, I swear I felt like I was being watched and heard a few strange sounds. My father and I didn't hear any footsteps or anything overtly unusual, though. The next morning, I went off to take a leak, and about 100 feet from our camp, I noticed a small fire pit on the trail. I touched the ashes, and they were completely soaked, which meant someone had recently had a fire there and put it out with water. We had food and supplies for 4 nights, but after finding that fire pit, we packed up and left that morning. I've been taking a supplement called lion's mane for the past few months, which is known to support brain function and improve memory. To my surprise, it's been working really well. Lately, I've been recalling a lot of vivid memories from my early childhood, especially from when I was about 4 to 6 years old. Most of them are good memories, but one stands out more than the others. When I was younger, my parents would often take my brother and me to a small town in Colorado for vacations. We loved the peaceful atmosphere of small towns and the open mountain ranges, and this town became our regular vacation spot. This place was tiny, only about 300 people lived there. Originally a mining town in the late 1800s, the families of the miners had stuck around, and their descendants still lived there. Everyone in town knew each other, and since we visited often and owned a few acres on the edge of town, they knew us too. I remember one particular vacation during the start of winter. My parents took my brother and me there for one of our school breaks, and my grandparents came along to join us. I had such a great time, walking with the family and playing with the new toys my grandparents had brought me. One of the toys they gave me was a small remote control ATV with a toy man sitting on it, wearing a helmet and a biker jacket. This toy is the reason this memory stands out, and you'll see why shortly. During the trip, we decided to take a walk around the less populated parts of the town. The town had a lot of walking trails and scenic routes, which we always enjoyed exploring when we visited. One of our favorite routes included a bridge that overlooked a steep valley, and the view from that bridge was breathtaking. As we approached the bridge, we saw a man sitting with his back against the guardrails. Now, remember the toy I mentioned? The man was also wearing a helmet and a biker jacket, just like the toy. I thought this was really cool and told the man, "You look just like my toy." My mom immediately told me not to bother the man, saying something like, "Oh, honey, he's tired and needs to rest." I didn't think much of it because, as an overly talkative kid, I was used to my parents telling me not to engage with strangers. Then, my dad mentioned that he knew the man and that he would talk to him for a bit while we continued our walk. He told us to go ahead, and he would catch up later. I didn't think anything of it because, in that small town, everyone knew everyone. My mom quickly grabbed my brother and me by the hands and practically hurried us past the man as we continued our walk. At that moment, I started to feel something was off because it seemed like my mom was rushing for no reason. I asked her who the man was, and she simply said it was a friend of my dad's and that he would be back later. I didn't think about it much after that, and we enjoyed the rest of our walk. It wasn't until we returned to the cabin we were staying in that I thought about it again. I asked my dad who the man was, and he told me it was just an old friend who lived there. After that, we never spoke about it again. Here we are now, nearly 2 decades later, and this memory pops into my mind today when I see a kid in my apartment complex playing with a similar toy to the one that my grandparents had gotten me. I remembered those nice vacations and how much I enjoyed looking off into the vast space of the mountains and valleys. I remembered playing with that toy ATV in the backyard of that vacation cabin, showing my grandparents all of the cool tricks I could do with it. And I remembered that man sitting on the bridge and how my mom was in such a hurry to get on with the walk while my dad stayed behind to talk to the guy. Suddenly, that memory didn't quite feel right. Something was off. I kept thinking about it through the rest of this morning, wondering why my mom was so insistent that we move on. Wondering how my dad could have possibly recognized the man when his head and face were completely covered by a helmet. I texted my dad asking him, "Do you remember that time we were on vacation in Colorado and you ran into one of your friends sitting on a bridge that we were walking on?" It suddenly popped into my head, and I remember it being kind of a weird situation. What happened there? At this point, I was pretty sure I already knew the answer to that question. I just got off the phone with my dad about an hour ago. He called me after seeing my text. He said he didn't think that I would even remember that happening, but that he thinks about it all the time and that he often worried about whether my brother and I understood what was going on in that moment. He explained the entire thing to me and my suspicions were confirmed. While we were taking one of our usual walks, we came up to a bridge and my parents saw that man sitting there leaning against the bridge. Or to put it more accurately, that man's body. My parents were alarmed when I immediately tried to talk to the body about my new toy. So my dad quickly came up with the idea to say that he knows the guy and that he would meet us later because he wanted to talk to the man. In reality, he had never met the man before in his life. He just wanted to check to see if the man still had a pulse and call 911 about the situation. This next part is what made my dad feel extremely uncomfortable and still makes him feel queasy thinking about it today. He didn't want my brother and I to understand what was actually going on. So in order to conceal the fact that this man was probably no longer alive, he sat down next to the body and started talking to it. He had to sit right next to this man's body and carry on a one-sided conversation with it until we were out of earshot. At that point, he checked the man's pulse and confirmed what he already knew: that resting biker would be resting forever. This was before cell phones were very common, and even then, there would have been no way to get a signal in an isolated town like this. He ran back to town, called the county sheriff from a landline, and ran back to the bridge to wait for them to arrive. While my dad was waiting there, he looked around to try to figure out what happened, and it wasn't hard to tell. The bridge had started to get icy because it was the start of winter, and this man must have been taking the curb onto the bridge a little too quickly. My dad looked over the edge of the bridge, and sure enough, there was a motorcycle at the bottom of the valley. The man had crashed, probably been injured very badly, and had propped himself up hoping that help would arrive. My family did come across him, but not soon enough. Looking back on it, we never took that walking path again in all the times we vacationed there in the future. I think my dad wanted to avoid it, both because the memory of having to talk to a body and pretend it was alive made him feel sick, and because he didn't want my brother and I remembering the situation and figuring out what actually happened. The first siren pierced the night like a knife, yanking me from a restless sleep. For a moment, I thought it was part of a dream. The sound felt out of place, almost unreal, in the peaceful campground nestled at the base of the old dam. But as the wail grew louder, joined by others in a rising chorus of alarms, the dreadful truth hit me. This wasn't a dream. This was a nightmare unfolding in real time. I had arrived at Whispering Pines campground 3 days earlier, seeking solace in nature after an exhausting month at work. The campsite, with its view of the expansive lake created by the massive hydroelectric dam, had seemed like the perfect retreat. Sure, the other campers had murmured about the recent heavy rains and the rising water levels, but I had brushed off their concerns. The dam had been standing for decades. Surely it could handle a little extra water. Now, as I scrambled out of my tent into the pitch-black night, I realized just how wrong I'd been. The sirens screamed on, their relentless sound cutting through the air, and I could hear frantic voices from nearby campsites. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. What I saw froze me in place. People were running in all directions, some still in their pajamas, clutching whatever belongings they could carry. Children cried out in fear. Dogs barked, caught in the frenzy. And through it all, the sirens continued their terrifying wail. In the distance, the silhouette of the dam loomed, a shadowy wall against the dark sky. At its base, the sight that made my blood run cold. Water, surging and frothing, spilling over the top of the structure in several places. The dam was failing. The realization hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. We were in the flood zone. If that dam broke, we'd be swept away in minutes. I had to act now. My heart pounded as adrenaline coursed through my veins. I darted back into my tent, grabbing my backpack and shoving in anything I could reach. My phone, wallet, a bottle of water. There was no time for anything else. As I hurried out, I nearly collided with my neighbor from the next campsite, an elderly man named Frank I had chatted with earlier in the week. "We need to get to higher ground," he shouted over the cacophony, his face pale with fear. "There's a trail that leads up the hill behind the campground," he continued. "It's our only chance." I nodded, and together we sprinted toward the tree line. Around us, the chaos was overwhelming. A woman stumbled by, dragging a screaming toddler, her eyes wide with panic. A group of teenagers huddled together, paralyzed with indecision. And through it all, that incessant siren wail, punctuated now by a new, more terrifying sound. The deep, resonant groan of overstressed concrete. The trail Frank had mentioned was little more than a deer path. Barely visible in the weak beam of my flashlight, we stumbled upward, the uneven ground made treacherous by loose rocks and exposed roots. Behind us, I could hear others following, their ragged breathing and occasional cries of pain as they stumbled in the dark. We had climbed for perhaps 5 minutes when a sound like thunder split the air. Even over the sirens and the panicked shouts, it was deafening. Frank and I froze, turning to look back down the hill. In the faint moonlight, I saw it. A massive section of the dam's central face and collapsing in on itself. Water exploded through the breach, a wall of fury and foam that seemed to devour everything in its path. The campground disappeared in seconds. Tents and RVs swept away like toys in a bathtub. Run. Frank's voice snapped me back to reality. Run or we're dead. We scrambled upward with renewed desperation, clawing at the earth, pulling ourselves up by tree roots and low-hanging branches. The roar of the water grew louder with each passing second, drowning out even the sirens now. I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet, the very hill we were climbing seeming to shudder in the face of nature's onslaught. Somewhere behind me, I heard a scream cut short. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Every ounce of my being was focused on the path ahead, on the next handhold, the next step. My lungs burned. My muscles screamed in protest, but I pushed on. To stop was to die. I lost all sense of time as we climbed. Could have been minutes or hours. The world had narrowed to this. The feel of rough bark under my hands, the burn in my thighs as I pushed upward, the ever-present roar of the water behind us. Finally, mercifully, the ground began to level out. We had reached some kind of plateau high above where the campground had been. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my whole body shaking with exhaustion and residual terror. As my racing heart began to slow, I became aware of others around me. A handful of people have made it this far, maybe 20 or 30 in total. Some were crying softly, others sat in stunned silence. Frank stood at the edge of the plateau, peering down into the darkness below. I crawled over to join him, dreading what I might see but needing to know. The sight that greeted me would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Where the campground had been was now a churning lake. Debris-filled water stretching as far as the eye could see in the dim pre-dawn light. Trees stuck out of the flood at odd angles, and I could see the occasional glint of metal as the current tossed around the remains of RVs and cars. Of the dam itself, there was no sign. It had been entirely submerged by the very force it was meant to contain. As the sky lightened with the approaching dawn, the full scale of the disaster became clear. The valley below us had been transformed into a vast, muddy lake. Here and there, rooftops poked above the water. Farmhouses and barns that had stood for generations. Now islands in a sea of destruction. And floating on the surface, a grim testament to the lives lost in the night. Shapes I tried not to look at too closely, but couldn't entirely ignore. We huddled on that hilltop for hours, watching as helicopters began to appear overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the transformed landscape. Eventually, rescue teams made their way to us, bringing food, water, and the promise of evacuation. As I was helped into a rescue basket to be winched up to a hovering chopper, I took one last look at the scene below. The dam, which had seemed so solid, so permanent just days ago, was gone. In its place was a reminder of nature's awesome, terrifying power, and of how quickly our lives can change, how fragile our sense of security really is. In the days and weeks that followed, I learned more about what had happened that night. The dam, weakened by years of neglect and pushed to its breaking point by weeks of relentless rain, had finally given way. The resulting flood claimed dozens of lives and caused over $1 billion in property damage. Investigations were launched, fingers were pointed, promises were made never again. But for those of us who lived through it, who climbed that hill in the dark with death literally at our heels, no official report or government vow could ever erase the memory of that night. The sound of those sirens, the deafening roar of the water, the frantic scramble to survive. These things became a part of us, a brutal reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of human life. Now, years later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced I can hear the wail of flood sirens in the distance. In those moments, as I lie in the dark trying to slow my breathing, I think of Frank and the others who made it up that hill with me. I wonder if they, too, carry the weight of that night. If they, like me, see the world a little differently now, more aware of its dangers. Yes, but also more appreciative of its beauty and the precious gift of each new day. and I think of those who didn't make it, the names I read in newspaper articles, the faces I saw on memorial plaques. I think of the lives cut short, of futures erased in one terrible night, and I promise myself, as I do every time these memories resurface, to live fully, to embrace life deeply, to never take for granted the solid ground beneath my feet, or the peace of a quiet night. Because if that night taught me anything, it's that everything can change in an instant. And when it does, all we can do is run, climb, and hope that when dawn breaks, we're still standing. I don't want to give away too much about myself, but back in 2006, let's just say I was training with a special ops unit. At the time, I was mentally sharp, physically fit, and more capable in the wilderness than most experienced hikers you'd hear about in these kinds of stories. Not to mention, I was armed to the teeth. Just a week before my final exam, we were running a drill, and while I can't give you the specifics, my role was to stand guard at the perimeter on the backside of the assault in case the opposition tried to flank us. This was the third time we'd run this particular drill, so I knew it was a hurry up and wait kind of day. I was bored out of my mind, so I started scanning the tree lines. That's when I noticed something I could only call a path. It wasn't a traditional path, but the trees on either side of it seemed to form a straight line. One of the things we were taught when training to survive from an elevated vantage point is that nature doesn't build in straight lines. To this day, I still can't explain what came over me, but I laid my gun down and just started walking. Walking turned into a jog, and jogging turned into a sprint. I remember thinking I really wanted to know where this path led, and how many people before me had followed a straight line like this in nature. During PT, I always survived long-distance runs on tracks by staring down at my feet, so out of habit, I did the same. And that's when I snapped out of it. I immediately thought to myself, what the heck am I doing? I turned around and sprinted back to my post. The path wasn't as straight as I remembered, and it felt much further back to my post. I didn't lose any time, and I didn't see anything strange. No mysterious woman beckoning me into the woods or anything like that, and I didn't feel any great sense of dread like you sometimes hear in these stories. I returned to my post, and the drill concluded. All of our drills were monitored by cameras at each position, so I had to answer for my actions. Honestly, I thought I was done for. They questioned me, and I just told them I didn't know what came over me. I just felt this overwhelming urge to follow that path and see where it led. My superior simply told me to resist that urge if I ever felt it again, and sent me on my way. A week later, I graduated, and I never really thought much of it again. Now, here's the real kicker. There was a troubled teen school nearby, and we'd run into them from time to time. They'd come out to watch our final physical test. I'd heard rumors that the school shut down in 2010 because a kid went missing. They covered it up, filed for bankruptcy, and told the kid's family he committed suicide, but they never produced a body. His last known location? The exact spot where I temporarily lost my senses that day. This story is going to be told partly from my perspective and partly from my brother's, and it's going to be a long one. It's a true story that happened just last night while I was at my grandma's house. So, to set the scene, I went to grab McDonald's in the nearest city, which is about 20 minutes away from where we live. After that, I decided to head over to my grandma's place instead of going straight home. For some context, my grandma lives down a long farm road, and to get to her house, you have to turn down a half-mile dirt driveway. I arrived around 9 p.m. and went inside to visit with her and my brother, who has been living with her ever since my grandpa passed away, so she wouldn't be living alone out there. Around 10:30 p.m., my brother and I took my grandma's dog outside to go to the bathroom. We sat out there for a while, listening to music and talking. By this point, I was starting to get cold since it was East Texas, and I wasn't yet used to it getting down into the low 40s at night. I decided it was about time to head inside. While I was about to stand up, I noticed something moving in the corner of my eye near the large metal shop a few hundred yards from the house. I didn't think much of it at first because it's common for deer or raccoons to wander into the yard, and since my grandma's dog wasn't barking, I assumed it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. We finally went back inside, and my grandma went to bed around 11 p.m. My brother and I stayed up a little longer, playing Among Us and watching YouTube videos. At around 2:30 a.m., I was getting really tired and decided it was time to head home. So I asked my brother to walk me to the door and make sure I got out to my car safely, since I tend to be paranoid at night. He joked around, saying he'd turn the lights off and lock the door behind me, which made me freak out, so I begged him to walk me out. He eventually agreed, and I got in my car, immediately locking the doors. As I drove off down the dirt road, I saw the porch lights turn off in my rearview mirror. It took me about 10 minutes to get home, and once I got inside, I made myself some ice cream and sat down to enjoy some creepy horror stories on YouTube. About 15 minutes later, I got a FaceTime call from my brother. I picked up right away, and I could tell something was off. He didn't say anything right away, so I asked him what was wrong. What he told me next is my best attempt to paraphrase his words. After I left, he decided to go back outside to listen to some music and sit on the porch. He had the music cranked up pretty loud, which would normally mask any sounds of animals or other noises from the nearby woods. After a few minutes, though, he said he heard what sounded like metal banging around. He quickly paused the music to listen, trying to figure out what it was. He stood up and looked over towards the shop and the boat shed, which are next to each other, a few hundred yards away from where he was sitting. He saw a faint light shining around near the boat shed, but then it flicked off quickly. At this point, he started to freak out. He quietly crept back inside, locked the door behind him, and called me. He said that he ran to his room in the back of the house, I guess not thinking to wake up our grandma, and he grabbed his weapon. He quickly ran back outside and saw the glow of the flashlight move around and then quickly shut off as soon as he noticed it. He walked out to the edge of the concrete carport and stared out towards the boat shed with his weapon down at his side. The only thing illuminating the boat shed was the faint light coming from the house. He said that he tried to muster up the most intimidating voice he could manage and said, "Who is out there?" To which there was no immediate reply except for a slight bumping sound which solidified the fact that someone was indeed there. Now keep in mind, this is out in the middle of the country, in a town with a population of just over 1,000 people, and the nearest house is across the lake or miles down the farm road. So no well-meaning person would just happen to stumble across my grandma's house this late at night. Also, my grandma has had problems with people snooping around the property in the past, so this is not something any of us take lightly. And for the life of me, I can't tell you why my brother didn't just call the police. But you also have to remember, there is only a few cops in the entire town, and it is 3 a.m., and so it would take at least 30 minutes for the cops to even show up. So my brother again called for the person to show themselves and repeated his question and asked the person to identify themselves. He said that he practically crapped his pants as a tall, lanky figure slowly emerged from the boat shed with a flashlight in hand. Although my brother couldn't see any distinct features about the person, he could definitely tell that it was an older man and that it was no one that we knew. It was especially not anyone that should be in our boat shed at 3 a.m. At this point, he raised the weapon up to point at the man and again shouted, "Who are you?" The man was still silent and began slowly walking towards him. My brother took a step forward and gave one last verbal warning to the man and said, "I swear I'll use this. Now, who are you and why are you here?" The man quickly raised his hands up and said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, calm down, man," in a taunting voice as he continued walking towards my brother. My brother fired a single shot just above the man's head, to which he finally took that as his cue that my brother meant business. The man hurriedly took off on foot back down the driveway and my brother screamed, "Don't come back." My brother then quickly ran inside to wake up my grandma, who had somehow slept through the entire commotion. She didn't seem worried enough to actually call the police. But of course, after hearing this, all I could think about was what were the true intentions of that man. Was he just some druggie snooping around looking to steal some tools or money? Or were his intentions much more sinister? Another question that haunts me about this whole situation is how many times has this happened after my grandma and brother went to bed and we just didn't know? And was he watching us from the shadows all night? Was he watching me as I walked out to my car? What would have happened if my brother had actually turned out the lights and locked the door before I could get to my car? I have a pretty good imagination, but I really don't like to use it thinking about the possibilities. And to the stranger who tried to rob us or do God knows what at 3 o'clock in the morning, I hope you learned your lesson. This is one of my favorite stories to tell because it really captures my childhood and fits the atmosphere of the place I grew up. It was 2009 and I was in high school, living on an island where most people stayed close to the coast. But my family's house was deep in the mountains. Picture this, a house in the woods, but at the very peak of a mountain. Every night, thick mist surrounded the house like something out of a creepy horror movie. The woods started just a couple of feet away from the walls, and our nearest neighbor was a 15-minute drive away. Not far from us, there was an abandoned house, probably once owned by a distant relative, but it had been empty for over 40 years. There were no streetlights, and animals roamed freely around the area. This part is crucial for the story. While you couldn't see anyone hiding just a meter away in the woods, you could hear absolutely everything, even from a kilometer away. If we saw headlights or heard a car, my family and I would instantly turn off all the lights and hide. I don't know why, we were shy, antisocial, maybe just cautious, but it was a routine. I think that sets the scene well enough, but I'll add a few more details to make it clearer. Our house was small and pretty run down, but we had a good car. I'm not too knowledgeable about cars, but my dad always said that without a reliable vehicle, we'd never be able to get up and down that mountain. At that moment, it was about 11 p.m., and there were 8 people in the house. I was sitting at the dining table, enjoying a bowl of cereal while watching anime. Just a perfect, quiet evening. The lights were on, so nothing could be seen from outside in the dark. There was a window in front of me, looking out toward the front entrance and the only road leading to our house. I noticed something outside but didn't hear anything. I thought I saw a human silhouette standing still, but I figured it was just a trick of the light from the house's reflection. So, I brushed it off and kept watching anime, eating my cereal. Then, I noticed movement again, but this time the silhouette was waving at me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze. The person outside continued waving, trying to get someone inside the house to notice. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 10 seconds, he called out, "Hello, I need help." At this point, my parents heard him too and came over to the window, confirming that I wasn't seeing things or imagining a ghost. I was relieved, to say the least. The man outside went on to explain that his car had been stolen at gunpoint, and he needed help. My parents were baffled because there hadn't been any sounds of footsteps or a car, so they began whispering their theories among themselves, unsure of what to make of it all. For the mysterious guy's story to be true, he had to be mugged more than a mile away, got his car stolen, and then walk for half an hour in the dark through the woods following the dim light of our house. My parents still decide to believe him, and they offer calling the police. Our visitor begs to say the stupidest thing he could have. "Don't call the police. I don't have a gun." My parents stay silent for a while. The guy outside knows he's messed up but proceeds to make his request. "Can I get a ride downtown?" My dad nervously chuckles and gives him an excuse. He mentions the time, the fact that he felt that the guy was lying, and that he had already called the police, which was a lie. This is when my favorite part of the story begins. I stand up from the table, shaking. I go to a closet, and even though I can't see the guy's face, I know he's still following my actions. I get 2 machetes that are half my size and run to the other room. I was terrified, and looking back, I probably took away the only weapons my parents could have used to protect themselves in case of an altercation. I open a door to the room where me and my siblings sleep, and they were watching some silly show, probably something stupid like Hannah Montana or iCarly, and their hyena laughter came out. My sisters are loud, and my younger brothers are 4 years old, 7 years old, and 9 years old. So their laughs are angelical by day and demonic by night. I signal at them to shut up, and they do so, joining me and my parents in our fear. We hear in silence as the guy says, "It's okay if you can't help me. I'll go to the next house." "There's no next house. You should wait for the police here," my dad said. "I don't need the police. I'm good." This goes back and forth. The guy is now in good shape to walk an hour down the mountain to reach downtown. My dad offers a rusty metal tricycle from our porch so that he can go downtown as a joke. The guy accepts this offer and grabs the tricycle. I assume he just wanted to leave with something. This tricycle is 20 years old and it definitely doesn't work. We hear it screeching for a couple of seconds as the stranger struggled to be able to ride it, and then it stopped not too far away from our house. It seemed like he stopped, and we didn't hear any footsteps that indicated the guy had left. After trying to identify if he was still on site to no avast, my dad calls the police. We wait in silence looking at the road from the front windows. 50 minutes later, the police get there. Amazing time back home. Heroic even. And as soon as the red and blue lights show up, they illuminate the entire road up to the abandoned house. The tricycle is still in the road not too far away. The police claim not seeing anybody on the road. Only one road in the mountain. If the guy kept on walking, they would have seen him. So they just take a look at the woods with a flashlight and call it a day. The cops were clearly freaked out by the eerie look of our house and didn't stay for more than 5 minutes. Nothing else happened that night. I slept with 2 machetes under my pillow, which I remember angered one of my sisters. We have no idea who the person was. No carjackings reported the next day. And even though a lot of weird things happened around my house, we never saw this guy again. It's pretty obvious he was trying to steal our family's car. But there were a few things we could never understand. Where did he come from? Where did he go? If his story was true, he had the worst luck in the world. I think the situation was interesting because I think about his point of view and our horror night turns a bit comical. I mean, imagine this. You go to rob a house. Turns out the people inside speak calmly. I don't know how much criminals encounter this as they try to intimidate or deceive. There's a scrawny, seemingly mute kid that tries to be sneaky and grabbing some machetes and then hide in the darkness in the house. And there's child's laughter coming from the non-visible rooms from the house. He could see the doors, but the inside of the rooms would be geometrically impossible to look into from the windows. I think we were lucky to out-creep the creep that night. I don't see any other reason for the guy to back out from his plans. The guy clearly had a gun and bad intentions, not to mention his ability to ninja walk through a forest where we even hear wildcats walking around. Also, no neighbors to witness or hear anything. It started with a package. No return address. No markings. Just a plain, brown-wrapped box sitting on my doorstep when I got home from work. I hesitated before picking it up, something about it setting my nerves on edge. But curiosity won. Inside was a VHS tape. There was no label, no indication of what was on it. Just an old black cassette, its edges worn, the plastic slightly cracked. I didn't own a VCR, but I knew my neighbor did. So after some internal debate, I brought it next door. Found it on my doorstep. I told him, holding it up, "Think we can check what's on it?" He gave me a skeptical look but shrugged, leading me inside. His living room smelled of stale coffee and old books, the TV a relic from the early 2000s. He slid the tape into the VCR, and after a moment of static, the screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, dark. At first, it showed nothing but an empty hallway, narrow, dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a flickering light bulb. The camera was shaky, as if someone was holding it, breathing heavily behind the lens. The silence was suffocating. Then the camera moved. It crept forward, footsteps barely audible, the breathing growing heavier. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, door after door on either side. But they were all closed, locked. A whisper broke the silence. "Don't turn around." My neighbor and I exchanged uneasy glances. The voice was distorted, barely more than a rasp, but something about it sent a chill up my spine. The camera kept moving, the hallway narrowing. The breathing turned into ragged gasps. A shadow flickered at the edge of the screen, just for a moment. Then the tape cut to static. My neighbor cursed under his breath, fiddling with the remote. "Might be damaged," he muttered. Then the tape resumed. This time, the camera faced a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly open. A hand, pale and unnaturally thin, reached out from the darkness beyond the doorframe. The camera jolted violently, as if the person holding it had started running. The hallway blurred past in a disorienting rush. But something was behind them, a shape, moving fast. The whisper returned, urgent now. Don't turn around. Then the screen went black. My neighbor exhaled, shaking his head. What the hell was that? Some kind of prank. I wasn't listening. My pulse pounded as I stared at the dark screen, waiting, dreading. I wanted to believe it was a hoax, an old horror short someone had made. But something gnawed at my gut. Then the TV flickered again. The hallway was back. But this time it wasn't empty. A figure stood in the middle of the screen, facing away. Tall, unmoving, its head slightly tilted. The camera didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, so slowly it barely seemed to move at all, the figure began to turn. My neighbor ripped the tape from the VCR, the screen cutting to static. We sat there in stunned silence, the air heavy. Then his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Don't turn around. Neither of us did. We tried to forget about it. My neighbor threw the tape away the next morning, tossing it into the dumpster behind his apartment. I went about my day, pretending it hadn't shaken me, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, I heard something outside my window, not knocking, not scratching, breathing, slow, deliberate, just beyond the glass. My curtains were drawn, but I could feel it standing there, waiting. I didn't move, didn't check. I just lay in bed, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling until the sun rose. The next day, my neighbor called me. You threw the tape away, right? I asked immediately. Pause. Then, yeah, but I checked the dumpster this morning. It's gone. I swallowed. Maybe someone took it. Yeah, maybe. We left it at that. But that afternoon, as I stepped outside, I saw it. A package, identical to the first, sitting on my doorstep. This time, I didn't open it. I took it straight to my car, determined to get rid of it for good. My neighbor agreed to come with me, and we drove miles out of town to an old bridge over a river. I stepped out, gripping the package tightly, my hands trembling. We throw it in and leave. That's it. He nodded, silent. We walked to the railing, and I forced myself to look at the box one last time. Then I threw it into the rushing water below. It disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the current. Relief flooded me. I turned to my neighbor, letting out a shaky laugh. That's done. But his face had gone pale. He was staring at my car. I followed his gaze, my stomach nodding. Package sat on the hood. Identical. No, I whispered. That's not possible. We backed away slowly, fear creeping into my limbs. Then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Don't turn around. I didn't. Neither did my neighbor. We got into the car and drove without speaking, without stopping. I don't know how long we drove, but when I finally pulled up to my house, I felt sick. Another package was waiting on my doorstep. I didn't touch it, didn't move it. I locked my doors and shut my curtains, ignoring every knock, every buzz from my phone. That was 2 nights ago. This morning, my neighbor's apartment was empty, his door wide open, his phone left on the floor, buzzing with unread messages. And now, I hear breathing inside my house. My family has a cabin in a tiny hamlet in British Columbia with only about 150 residents, and it's been a tradition for us to stay there every summer. Because we're there so often, we know most of the locals except for the few people who rent cabins from the owners. One year, when I had just turned 18, I was out there with my favorite cousins. Since I was older, I usually took on the role of looking out for the younger ones, especially the girls. After a late breakfast, we headed down to the beach, which was unusually crowded because the hamlet was celebrating its town days. Hundreds of people from neighboring towns were there to party. At the time, most of my family was fishing, so it was just me and 3 of the girls. Brooke, who was 12, Emma, who was 11, and Rhea, who was 8. We spent some time sunbathing, making sandcastles, and eventually went into the water to cool off. I'm kind of a wimp, so I took my time getting in after them. I was up to my waist when a guy walked up and started talking to me. He introduced himself as Shane and said he loved my tattoos, adding that he had wanted to say something while we were on the beach but hadn't had the courage until now. I thanked him and we made small talk. I found out he was only a couple of years older than me, and his family also had a cabin in the area that they visited every summer. It struck me as odd since I had spent the last 18 years of my life here every summer, and I definitely didn't recognize him. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd seen him around or that he'd gone through some crazy growth spurt, like some of my cousins had. We kept talking, but I couldn't shake the uneasy vibe I was getting from him. Eventually, my cousins came over to see what was going on, and Shane introduced himself to them. All 5 of us ended up spending a couple of hours hanging out on the dock, chatting or playing Dock Wars, basically a game where everyone tries to push each other off. Knowing my grandparents would be starting dinner soon, we said our goodbyes, and I walked back to the cabin with the 3 girls. Later that evening, I was sitting on the deck with the other adults and Rhea and Emma when we heard a quad roll down the front street. Quads are the main form of transportation in the area, so it wasn't unusual. Emma perked up and said, "Hey, it's Shane." I glanced up and saw that he had slowed his yellow quad to a crawl when passing our front gate, then sped off again. I asked Emma if she was sure, and she insisted it was him. That's when I felt that weird, uneasy feeling intensify. We had never told or shown him which cabin was ours, so there were 2 unsettling possibilities. 1, he would have had to have followed us back from the beach, which didn't make sense since he had told me where his cabin was. And 2, he could have been cruising around looking for our cabin, trying to figure out which one we were staying in. Regardless, mission accomplished, he now knew. The next day, the same 3 cousins wanted to hike to the rope swing, which was 3 miles down the Trans-Canada Trail that ran directly behind the cabin. I, of course, volunteered to take them. Sounded fun. We exited into the trail through the backyard, and just as we were reaching the old trestle bridge, now just a rickety old footbridge, we see a yellow quad coming towards us. We moved out of the way, and he stops in front of us, and I see it's Shane again. The typical "hey, how you doing's" happened, and before I could stop her, Rhea tells him we're going to the rope swing. I didn't want him to tag along after he went out of his way to find our cabin last night. Thankfully, he said he was heading into the bigger town just now, so we parted ways quickly. 20 minutes later, we're nearing the halfway mark of our journey. For probably the 30th time that day, we heard a quad coming up behind to pass us, so we move over. As soon as he passes, I see it's Shane on his yellow quad. Awesome. Guess he decided to join us after all. I'm not confrontational, so I smile and wave to be polite, and he responds by intentionally spinning his tires to spray us with loose gravel and dirt and then speeds off. What an idiot. My bad feeling about him shot way up, so we turned around and decided to just go to the beach instead. At this point, Brooke told me she didn't like him and he gave her the creeps, while Rhea and Emma chimed in with, "Yeah, he's weird." I'm glad they already knew to listen to their instincts as well. The next few days were uneventful. We only saw Shane in passing on his squad, but I no longer waved at him after he pulled his little gravel stunt. The 3 girls would always alert me and each other if they saw him, which I was thankful for because he started acting a little hostile. When he passed us, he would slow down and crawl past us close enough to almost run over my feet, then speed off while giving us or just me the finger. Keep in mind, I was never rude to him. Everything seemed cool when we hung out the one time, and I kept my nicest face on despite being uneasy about his presence. Yet he seemingly had some vendetta against me. Maybe I accidentally let on that I didn't want him to join us at the rope swing. I'll never know. About a week later, I was sitting on the deck reading when a group of the kids wanted to go to the general store for candy. I opted out this time. My book was getting really good, so my uncle took all 7 of them to get the snacks, and I jokingly said to watch out for yellow quads. 15 minutes later, I hear kids yelling with the distinct voice of my uncle, and they run up to the driveway saying, "She's trying to run us over." What? I asked what had happened, and my uncle tells me that while they were leaving the general store, he had spotted the familiar kids and apparently made a beeline for all of them speeding up. My uncle stood between the quad and the group, and Shane had turned away at the last second, missing them by inches. Immediately, all of the adults were in a rage, asking who this guy was and why he had done that. The 4 of us gave the lowdown on him, and they told us to avoid him. Obviously, we discussed reporting it since it was bordering on violence, but we decided not to for a couple of reasons. One, other than his first name, I had absolutely zero information on him. Two, in a small hamlet 1 hour away from the nearest town with emergency services, cops were very, very few and far between. My grandpa said it was unlikely that they'd even consider it worth their time, so we dropped it. The rest of the trip was great. No one saw Shane again for the remaining days. I thought the weirdness was over, but unfortunately, I was wrong. Because of circumstances out of my control, I wasn't able to go back to the cabin next year. The following September, we had a big family dinner, which was the first time I got to see some of my cousins in a year. Partway through the night, Emma and Brooke run up to me and say they saw Shane a lot again that summer. My stomach dropped, and I asked them if he kept up to his usual antics. Unfortunately, he had. Since I wasn't there, I guess he switched his main focus to Brooke. Thankfully, they were smart girls, so they kept avoiding him, even going on missions, as they called it, communicating by walkie-talkies to make sure he wasn't around whenever they went anywhere. It honestly made me sad to hear that these kids had their fun, carefree summer tainted by having to watch out for some idiot on a yellow quad every day. I couldn't believe he was still bothering them. They said they had a couple of more close calls of him speeding towards them, but he never got more than a foot away before turning back around. I asked their parents if it was true, and they were as uneasy as me, saying he would prowl back and forth in front of the cabin in the evenings to the point where they had to yell him to buzz off. I've been back for the summer getaways off and on since then, but I haven't had any more encounters with Shane. I haven't even seen the familiar yellow quad, which makes me think that he hasn't been back at all. Brooke, Emma, and Rhea continue to make little jokes here and there like, "Don't let Shane get you," when people leave the cabin. But otherwise, the whole ordeal has been mostly forgotten. As much as I hate the fact that those innocent little girls got caught up in it, I also know it was a great lesson to them to trust your intuition about people and be wary of strangers, especially the ones that follow you home and try to run you over. This story takes place 2 years ago when I was living with my 2 younger sisters and my father. We lived in a neighborhood that wasn't necessarily dangerous, but it wasn't the best place either. I remember some neighbors getting arrested for selling drugs when I was about 5, but that's not really relevant to this story. In the summer of 2018, my sisters and I would stay up late into the night, sometimes not going to bed until the sun was coming up. I was 17, my sisters were 15 and 13, and my dad would go to bed early because he was, well, an adult. To set the scene, I need to explain a little bit about our house. It was a single-story home with 4 doors on the front. 3 of them led to the living room, and 1 led into my bedroom. Our backyard fence had recently been knocked down by a storm, and there were 2 doors at the back of the house. 1 to the kitchen and 1 to my dad's room. One night, around 12:30 a.m., I was doing what I usually did, listening to scary stories on my phone while I made art on my iPad. I didn't use earbuds because I've always been paranoid that something might happen while I'm wearing them. My sisters, who shared a room down the hall from me, were doing whatever they did at night. It didn't really concern me. My dad was fast asleep in his room. Now, I don't know if anyone else gets this way, but when I'm listening to scary stories, I become hyper-aware of everything around me. So you can imagine how hard I jumped when I heard a sharp pounding on our front door. For loud thuds echoed through the house, and I could feel the front door shake with the force of each knock. I held my breath, hoping I had heard wrong. I really didn't want to think that someone was at my front door. At that moment, my middle sister, Jen, came running into my room, trying to keep her steps quiet. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "You heard that too, right?" she asked, her voice trembling. I swallowed and nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to wake up Dad," I said, moving toward my father's bedroom. She followed closely behind me. On our way to our dad's room, my youngest sister, Ness, peeked out from her room. She looked just as scared. I opened my dad's door and shook him awake, my hand trembling slightly. One of my biggest fears was someone breaking into our house. "Dad, someone's at the front door," I said, feeling sick to my stomach. "What?" My dad groggily responded, clearly annoyed we had woken him up. "There's someone here," Jen whispered. "I heard it." I repeated, "Someone knocked on the door." My dad, still tired and clearly not believing us, slowly got out of bed. He knows that my sisters and I tend to overreact to things, so he assumed we were just imagining it. I watched, my stomach in knots, as he went to the front door. "There's no one out here," he told us, looking through the blinds, unimpressed. I felt a little defeated. My heart sank, and for a moment, I started to doubt myself. But my sisters had heard it too, so I knew I wasn't crazy. We tried to convince him to take it more seriously, but he was too tired to care and didn't believe us. He went back to bed, leaving us feeling uneasy and alone with our fear. Dejected but scared, I ended up taking my mattress off my bed and sleeping in my sister's room for the night, taking a baseball bat and laying it next to my mattress. My overactive imagination had me thinking that whoever was at the door was out to hurt us, and I knew I would have to defend my younger sisters against any danger that dared to enter our house. The next day passed just fine. My sisters and I knew that we had heard something, and our dad brushed off our attempts to explain it. He thought we were sleep deprived, or perhaps that a large bug had hit our door, which was ridiculous. It wasn't until 11 p.m. that night, when my father was lounging on one of the couches in the living room, that we heard the pounding again. Only this time, it was much more aggressive and directly on the door behind my father. My father let out a loud, "What the?" and charged towards the front door. I had been standing in the living room when the pounding occurred again, and my sisters had rushed to stand next to me after hearing my father shout. We were all shaken. Our father never yelled like that. I started to cry as my father went to rush outside and confront whoever was out there. I begged him not to go outside because I thought he might get hurt. He told my sisters and I to call the cops, and he cursed some more when he realized that whoever had knocked on the door was gone. My sisters called the cops, and they arrived fairly quickly, talking with my dad about what was going on, claiming that there had been other complaints about this happening nearby, and explaining that they would try their best to find out who was doing it. The police did a search around our house, but didn't find anyone, even searching the backyard where I was afraid the perpetrator might be. The police assured us that someone would patrol the neighborhood that night. Once the cops were gone, my dad apologized for not believing us the night before. We said it was okay and left it at that. He locked all the doors and stayed up later than my sisters and I. I couldn't calm down, so I slept in my sister's room that night as well. Eventually, though, I put this situation behind me. A few months had passed, but not without nightmares and sleep paralysis about the whole ordeal. Most nightmares ending with someone breaking in and hurting my sisters. Other nightmares ending in more brutal ways. I had thought nothing more of the whole thing. That is until one day, I came home from school and Ness ran up to me, buzzing with energy. She proceeded to tell me that, apparently, the cops had found out who was knocking on everyone's doors about a month or so ago. It was an older man who lived a few houses down from us. They had gotten him to stop, and I am not sure if he was given a warning or whatever. He was a little unstable mentally, and nobody had opened their doors for him. Ness then told me that the same guy had been arrested earlier this day. I was shocked. He had only been knocking on people's doors at odd hours of the night. I'm happy to say that he is in jail and no longer lives in that neighborhood. I haven't done any more looking into his crime other than trying to confirm it for myself the day he was arrested. I'm also happy to say that after another recent event where someone tried to break into our house, my father installed a Ring doorbell, the doorbell with a camera, which gave my sisters and I some comfort. I really hope this man gets what he deserves, or maybe that he gets the help that he needs, if he really is insane. This happened while I was in college, living in Isla Vista, the student community at UCSB, which is known for being a party school. It definitely lived up to its reputation. While I enjoy a good party, the people there were on a whole other level, and as a result, there were a lot of risky situations, excessive drinking, carelessness, and people not locking doors, among other things. The area had a very isolated, almost eerie vibe, and anyone hanging around who wasn't a college student immediately looked out of place and unsettling. One night, after a few drinks, I came home to my small house, where I lived with two other girls, probably around 2:30 a.m. We were all serious students, and when we partied, it wasn't the typical UCSB rager. More like a small, relaxed gathering with friends. We often had people stay over, crashing on the couch or in one of the bedrooms. That night, my roommates had some guests I didn't know, and when I got home, I noticed one of them had chosen the couch to sleep on. I didn't turn on the lights because I didn't want to wake him, but as I walked past the couch to my bedroom, I noticed something strange. The guy was lying incredibly stiff, like he was putting all his energy into being as still and rigid as possible. I hesitated, and suddenly, his head jerked to face me, his limbs staying frozen in place. His eyes were wide open and glinting in the dark. I figured I had just startled him, or maybe he was drunk or high and couldn't sleep, so I quickly moved to my room and locked the door. The guy made me uncomfortable, and I wasn't taking any chances. I fell asleep, trying to shake off the unease. At 4:30 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound at the door. It was like someone was gently tapping their fingers against the wood. I lay still, listening. The sound grew louder, now more like scratching, until it was clear that the guy was using both hands, scratching frantically and forcefully. The noise became so loud and aggressive that it filled me with dread. I grabbed my phone and texted my roommate, too scared to make a sound. I messaged, "Your friend is freaking me out. Is he coked out? Can you talk to him? He's banging and scratching on my door." When I didn't get a response, probably because she was asleep, I texted my other roommate, trying to cover all my bases. At this point, the scratching had been going on for several minutes, and I had no idea how he was sustaining it. Scratching a wooden door with your nails can't feel good. He also started jiggling the door handle violently. Since neither of them responded, I decided to call them, though I was terrified to make any noise. Sounds silly, but there was something genuinely horrifying about being toyed with like that through the door. It felt like he was trying to intimidate me, and I could tell that this guy was really messed up. I considered calling the police, but wanted to talk to my roommates since one of them knew him. The scratching stopped abruptly, and I called my roommate, who answered sleepily. "Yo, your friend is messed up. Can you please deal with it? Do we need to call the cops? He's seriously scaring me," and he was scratching at my bedroom door. She didn't say anything for several seconds, and when she did speak, her voice had no sleepiness in it at all. "What friend?" she said. "That guy that was sleeping on the couch," I said. She was quiet again. "We didn't have any guys over." She said, "Call the police." My adrenaline surged, and I told her to please lock the bedroom door as quickly as possible. I realized that I hadn't heard scratching in a while, and I had no clue where he had gone. Suddenly, I heard a loud banging in the other end of the house where my roommates shared a bedroom. The bangs were followed by the sound of them screaming in fear. I quickly dialed the police as this maniac proceeded to bang against the locked bedroom door of my two roommates as they screamed. The heaviness of the blows left no doubt that he was trying to break the door down. I told the 911 operator the situation, and she dispatched 2 squad cars. The police in Isla Vista are generally used to peeling drunks off the sidewalk and breaking up brawling frat brothers. This was really serious and strange, and I think the dispatcher got the sense from my tone how terrified I was, and she stayed on the phone with me the whole time. At one point, the banging stopped and everything was quiet for a while. I talked with the dispatcher and suddenly looked down to see that the guy had slipped his fingers under my door and was just kind of wiggling them around, making this weird growling sound. I screamed and backed away, which is my biggest regret about this situation, since when I look back on it, it would have been really nice to just stomp the shit out of those fingers. When the cops rolled up, I heard running and the sound of our sliding glass door opening and closing, and then he was gone. The cops never caught him. He had broken in through our side door by jimmying the lock somehow. My door was covered in what turned out to be huge gashes that he had made using a pair of scissors, which he discarded on the ground before he left. What terrifies me most about this was that I walked right past him. I looked him right in the face. I realized now that he was not trying to sleep or on drugs, but was lying so stiff like that because he was hiding. He probably heard me open the door and freaked out because he hadn't realized there was another girl living there and tried to blend into the couch in the darkness. few months ago, I took in a puppy. Her original owners couldn't bond with her. They described her as unresponsive and disobedient, saying she didn't have the look they wanted. I honestly have no idea what they were talking about. She's the best behaved dog I've ever had, and she's absolutely adorable. I'm used to people stopping me on the street to pet her. Usually, they ask first or at least give a little verbal cue like, "Oh my gosh, look at that dog," to let me know they're about to come over. I'm completely fine with that. What I'm not okay with, though, is what happened on one of our earlier walks. I live in a small seaside town, and I like to take my dog on a little tour of the areas closest to the sea. We walk along the beach, down the promenade, around the miniature lakes, and then head home. Probably not the smartest thing to do the same route every day, but I've changed it up since this happened. We were at the final stage of our walk one evening, making a couple of laps around the lakes, when we passed a man. A lot of older men gather there regularly, so I didn't think much of it. This guy was sitting on a bench by the water, and I assumed he was staring because my dog was cute. I just kept walking. Then, from behind me, I heard him say, "Sit," and of course my dog, who's much more obedient than her previous owners let on, sat down immediately, looking up at me all happy and expecting a treat. I turned around, frowning, and saw that he was still sitting on the bench. I quickly encouraged my puppy to start walking again. We hadn't even gotten 5 feet before I heard him shout again, "Sit!" My dog did. I turned around, already glaring, and saw that the man was now standing. I told my dog to keep walking, trying to get her to pick up the pace so we could get to the path that leads up to the main street. But we were still nowhere near it when the man yelled again, "Sit!" and my dog sat down again. She was starting to look really confused, and honestly, I was terrified by now. He was getting closer, catching up with us. He was close enough that, even without my glasses, I could see he was grinning. That was enough for me. I stopped worrying about the path and scooped up my dog, running straight up the hill beside us. I climbed over the little fence that separates the lakes from the street. I looked back. The man didn't follow. He stayed at the bottom of the hill, looking up at us. His grin was gone. I'd never seen him before, and I haven't seen him since, and I really hope it stays that way. I'm not sure what his intentions were, but it felt like he was using my dog's obedience to slow me down, to keep me from getting away from him. I'm really glad I didn't stick around to find out. One morning, I spent the night at my girlfriend's house and had to leave early to go to work. It was so early that it was still dark outside, and I knew it would remain that way for a few more hours. She lived about 60 miles away from my house and work, in a rural town. As I drove, there were no streetlights along the road, and the only light came from my headlights. About 10 miles into my drive, my car began to slow down and eventually stopped. I immediately checked the gas gauge, and it was nearly full. Since I'm not very knowledgeable about car problems, I grabbed my phone from my jacket pocket and tried to turn it on, but nothing happened. I quickly realized that my phone was dead. It dawned on me that I had forgotten to plug it in the night before. Now I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, on the side of a rural road. I thought about my options. I could start walking, but no, that would be a terrible idea. It was pitch black outside, and I wouldn't be able to see anything. On top of that, there was a real risk of getting hit by a car. So, I decided my only option was to sit in my car and wait for daylight, though it was a stressful and frightening situation. It was winter, and I was starting to feel the cold. I repeatedly tried to start the car, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, I crossed my arms and sat there, staring into the darkness for what felt like an eternity. That's when I noticed something strange. About 30 yards away, I saw the outline of a person walking toward my car. They stopped just as I spotted them. My heart raced, and I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. Then, in a quick motion, they began walking toward me. Fast. In mere seconds, they reached my driver's side door and tried to open it. Did they think my car was empty? Did they see me? I quickly leaned away from the door and into the center console, hoping they wouldn't notice me. After failing to open the door, They stood there for a moment before suddenly turning around and walking back the way they came. I was confused and terrified. Why would they leave, and why would they go back in the direction they came from? I sat there, frozen in the dark, when suddenly I saw headlights in front of me. A car had parked on the same side of the road as mine, facing me. Had the person stopped when they saw my car? Why hadn't I noticed them park? My heart pounded as I watched the car start its engine, turn around, and drive off down the road. A few hours later, the sun began to rise, and a truck pulled up next to me. The driver asked if I was having trouble. I asked if I could use their phone, and I quickly called my girlfriend, who came to pick me up shortly after. In the summer of 1999, my family and I took a trip to Yosemite National Park. While we were there, we stayed at a motel called the Cedar Lodge, located in a more secluded area of the park. It was a nice place, but during the trip, I ended up getting a fever that had me feeling miserable. To avoid spreading it to the rest of the family, my mom decided to book a separate room for me. So, there I was lying in bed, sick as a dog, when suddenly, the air conditioning stopped working. I called the front desk and asked them to send someone to fix it. Not long after, the door opened on its own, and in walked a gruff-looking man with a very distinct handlebar mustache. After entering, he just stood there staring at me. I remember feeling really scared, but he was wearing a motel uniform and carrying a tool bag, so I assumed he was there to fix the AC. He didn't say a single word. He moved quickly to the AC unit, knelt down, and began working on it. Every few minutes, he'd turn around and look at me like I was something to be devoured. The entire time, he never said a word. Once he was done, he walked toward the door, paused as if he might say something, but then just closed the door without a word. That was the end of it. A few days later, we made it back to Florida, and I was feeling a lot better, thankfully, despite being sick for a good portion of the trip. My grandparents and I were watching TV when the main story on the program we were watching was about a serial killer who had been caught in Yosemite National Park. I immediately got a strange sensation crawling up my spine when they said his name, Cary Stayner. Then, a picture of the Cedar Lodge flashed on the screen. I was about to lose it, knowing that the next image would probably be of that mustache. Sure enough, they revealed that Cary Stayner had murdered 4 women right before our family visited the park. To this day, I get chills thinking about it. I was alone with that man. He could have easily killed me. It's eerie to think back on the way he stared at me, probably thinking about where he'd bury my body. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something was off before you even knew what it was? It's like your body senses something your mind hasn't quite figured out yet, and all you can do is trust that instinct. That's exactly how I felt when we pulled into that empty campsite. What was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in the woods, just me and a few friends, immediately felt different. It started small, like a faint whisper in the back of my mind telling me that something was wrong. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin the trip with unnecessary paranoia. But as we unpacked the car and set up our tents, that feeling only got stronger. We had driven for hours, deep into a national forest, where the trees stretched on endlessly and the hum of civilization was far behind us. The campsite wasn't on any official map, but Kyle, one of my closest friends, had found it through an outdoor enthusiast forum. He said it was off the beaten path, the perfect place to escape from everything. The idea seemed great in theory, peace, quiet, no other campers around. But standing there, surrounded by nothing but trees, the silence didn't feel calming. It felt suffocating. Pretty cool, right? Kyle grinned, tossing a bag of firewood onto the ground. We've got the whole place to ourselves. Yeah, I replied, trying to sound upbeat. Definitely secluded. Emily, my girlfriend, was already unpacking the cooler, humming as she worked. She didn't seem bothered by the isolation. Then again, she was always more adventurous than me. She thrived on these trips, the chance to disconnect. but I found myself glancing around more than usual, scanning the trees like I was expecting something to jump out at me. The afternoon passed quietly. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and reminisced about old times. Just the usual camping stuff. But even as the sun dipped below the horizon and the fire flickered warmly against the trees, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. The woods felt unnervingly quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the faint rustle of the wind through the branches. Just the crackling of the fire and the sound of our voices, too loud in the oppressive stillness. "You're awfully quiet tonight," Emily said, nudging me playfully. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." She didn't press it, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. Still, we fell into a comfortable rhythm, passing the time with stories and jokes. And eventually, I managed to push the unease out of my mind. But as the night wore on, things began to feel even stranger. Around midnight, we all decided to turn in. The fire had burned down to embers and the temperature had dropped enough that the idea of crawling into our sleeping bags sounded more appealing than staying up any longer. I zipped up our tent and lay down next to Emily, staring at the canvas above me as she quickly drifted off to sleep. The woods outside were still deathly quiet, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a faint sound, like someone or something was moving outside the tent. I sat up, my heart immediately pounding in my chest. The sound was subtle, just the soft crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. But in the absolute silence of the forest, it might as well have been thunder. I listened, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was just Kyle heading to the trees for a bathroom break or some animal wandering too close to camp. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too slow. I gently shook Emily awake. "Hey, do you hear that?" She groaned softly, half asleep. "What? There's someone outside," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Emily blinked, her tired brain trying to catch up. "It's probably Kyle," but I wasn't so sure. I glanced toward the small mesh window of the tent, but it was too dark to see anything. The fire had long since died, leaving the campsite bathed in shadows. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence of the woods pressing in on all sides. I slowly unzipped the tent, careful not to make any noise, and poked my head out. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the campsite, but there was no sign of anyone. Kyle's tent was still zipped up, his silhouette faintly visible inside. Whatever had been moving around wasn't him. I scanned the tree line, my eyes darting between the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone, or anything, just the empty campsite in the dark woods beyond. Emily sat up behind me, her voice quiet but tense. "Do you see anything?" I shook my head, still staring out into the darkness. "No, but something's out there." We waited for what felt like forever, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. After a while, Emily convinced me to lay back down, though I didn't sleep. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the silence, waiting for the sound to return. But it never did. Morning came, and with the sunlight, my anxiety from the night before felt almost foolish. Almost. The woods looked normal again. The unease from the previous night faded. Though not completely gone, Kyle was already up, poking at the remnants of the fire, oblivious to the strange tension that had settled over me and Emily. "Morning," he called cheerfully. "Sleep well?" "Yeah." I lied again. "You?" Like a rock, he grinned. I didn't tell him about the footsteps. It felt silly now, like maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe it really was just an animal. But that nagging feeling in my gut didn't go away. Something had been out there. The plan was to pack up after breakfast and head back to town. But as we started gathering our things, we noticed something odd. The path we'd taken to get to the campsite, the one that had been so clear when we arrived, was gone. Completely. We stood there, confused, staring at the dense trees where the trail should have been. I was sure we'd come this way. The car wasn't far, just a short hike through the woods. But now the trail was gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole overnight. "This doesn't make any sense," Cal muttered, scratching his head. "It was right here. Are you sure we're looking in the right spot?" Emily asked, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Yeah, this is it," I said, my heart starting to race again. We didn't come that far. The trail had been right here. We spent the next hour walking around the campsite, desperately searching for the path we had taken the day before, but it was gone, completely gone. The trees, which had seemed so familiar when we arrived, now looked identical in every direction. No markers, no trail, just an endless expanse of woods. Panic began to creep in. We had no cell signal, no map, nothing to help us find our way back. We were completely disoriented, and the more we searched, the more lost we became. "We need to stay calm," Kyle said, though I could hear the strain in his voice. "We'll find it. We just need to retrace our steps." But there were no steps to retrace. The woods had changed overnight, twisted into something completely unrecognizable. It felt as if the forest itself had decided we weren't going anywhere. By late afternoon, the tension was unbearable. The silence that had unnerved me the day before was back, but now it felt heavier. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of the leaves made my nerves tighten. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for the right moment. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the campsite, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. We weren't the first to get lost here. Near the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the underbrush, was the remains of an old campsite. Torn tents, rusted cans, and a half-buried cooler. Like someone had been here before, and like us, they had never left. I don't know what happened to them, and I don't know what will happen to us. But if you ever find yourself driving through these woods and are thinking about stopping to camp, don't.